Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 301. Maxie's face clouded with concern. Noticing this, Elliot said reassuringly, "Do not worry, my lady. There is still time until the agreed date. We simply returned earlier. The commander should be back sometime tomorrow." His kind smile made her feel better. More importantly, how was the investigation? Was it fruitful? Nevin inquired as he stirred the pot he had hung over the fire. Maxie detailed the basilisk breeding farm and the secret tunnel leading to the monster base. Listening with avid interest, Nevin poured her a bowl of soup. She accepted the ration and hungrily wolfed it down. Ruth, who had been slack with exhaustion, also filled a bowl for himself. While they rested, Quail and his men gathered in a corner to discuss something. Elliot went to check on the horses. Maxie was watching the knights absent-mindedly when Ruth leaned in and mumbled something in Elvish. She blinked, unable to catch what he had said. Nevin, on the other hand, seemed to understand immediately. He stared at Ruth in shock but kept his mouth firmly shut, clearly reluctant to interact with the traitor. He then wordlessly returned to stirring his bowl of soup. "I'm sorry. But my Elvish is a little short," Maxie confessed sullenly. Ruth heaved a sigh and repeated slowly using much easier vocabulary, "One think the Temple Knights are watching us." Maxie stared dumbly at Ruth before her eyes darted to Quail. The Temple Knight reacted instantly, his piercing eyes flying to her. She flinched and looked away. What makes you think that?" she asked Ruth in awkward Elvish. "Did you not notice? I got the feeling they were watching us throughout the investigation. No, even before that. They have been very careful to keep us in their sphere of influence. I sense they are observing the mage's every move." "Even if that were true, it's not all that strange," Nevin chimed in, unable to keep silent any longer. "We are cooperating out of necessity now, but the church and the mage tower are like oil and water. I've no doubt the church disapproves of us being this close to the magic of the dark mages. It is only natural that they would be wary of the mage tower getting hold of dangerous knowledge." Ruth's retort was too fast for Maxie to catch. Their argument continued until the Temple Knights joined them by the fire. Maxie mulled over Ruth's words in her head. Had there been anything strange in the Temple Knights' behavior? Since most of the paladins never spoke a word, it was impossible to tell what they were thinking. Even if the Temple Knights were hiding something, as Ruth suspected, there was no way to find out what that was. She was lost in her thoughts when the exhaustion of the day prevailed. Climbing up and down the snowy mountain had drained all her stamina. Coupled with a sated stomach, it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep her heavy eyelids open. She excused herself to lie down on a rug next to the brazier. As she fell into a deep sleep, she hoped Riftan would be there when she opened her eyes. It turned out to be a vain wish. The party investigating the city was nowhere to be seen, even by noon the next day. Maxie anxiously paced in front of the cave entrance. From time to time, she would climb on top of a rock to scan the surroundings. No matter how much she rubbed her eyes, none of the shadows were human. The silence within the cave was stifling as the sun went down. "What do you intend to do if they do not return tomorrow?" Nevin asked, finally breaking the silence. Alarmed, Maxie hastily covered his mouth. Ruth scowled and swatted her hand away. "You must know this yourself, but you are mad." Keep your voice down," Maxie hissed, anxiously glancing at the cave. Ruth looked first at Maxie, then at Talon in admonishment. "How did you know?" she said, trying to sound as bright as possible. "How could I not? You didn't speak a word all night." "It was obvious you were up to something," he said, his words landing like a woodpecker rapping her head. He stopped and heaved a heavy sigh. "What were you planning to do by yourself? Infiltrate the monster base on your own?" I might be reckless. But I am no fool," Maxie retorted in a hushed voice. "I plan to hide near the city and scout it as stealthily as possible. I might be able to find Riftan with tracing magic." "And? What were you going to do after that?" Maxie's shoulders tensed at the icy voice. When she turned her head, she found Quail Leon leaning against a rock. "There are better mages in his party," he said, slowly strutting over. "And to say nothing of Riftan Calypso's competence as a seasoned swordsman who has been through all manner of trials. How would you solve a predicament even they could not?" "I know. I can't do much," Maxie shot back, stubbornly raising her chin. But I can at least observe the situation and supply them with provisions. Their rations would have surely run out by now." "The monster base is a day's journey from here," Quail said coldly. "If they are in a situation they can escape, they will not perish from going without food for a few days. Now, if they do not manage to get free, It's no use no matter who goes to help them. Why, you really are a heartless man. Maxie desperately searched Gual's face before her emotions came bursting out. See, can you not understand? I will not abandon my husband in such a place. I must do whatever I can. Which is nothing. You would only be endangering your life. Maxie's face flushed crimson. Boiling with rage, she no longer felt the bone-piercing cold. And what concern is that of yours? She said bitingly. Losing 7 or 8 lives shouldn't make much difference to you. So why interfere? Gual remained unfazed by her harsh criticism. Maxie gripped Talon's reins and continued, her voice laced with steel. My task was to help you locate the monster base in the Pamela Plateau, and I have accomplished that. What I do next is my decision. And I choose to go to my husband. A moment of silence passed in which Gual observed her. Then, he said flatly. If you are so determined, then there is nothing I can do. Maxie eyed him with suspicion but eventually relaxed her shoulders. Right at that moment, a large hand flew at her, covering her face. Taken completely by surprise, she was about to shove the hand away when something flashed before her eyes. All the energy drained from her body. Staggering backward, she slumped into Gual's arms. She stared up at him in disbelief. The only hint of emotion he showed was an unreadable gleam in his green eyes. He raised a hand over her face. Soon, she slipped into darkness. Under the oak tree. Chapter 302. When Maxie came to, the setting sun had begun to tinge the sky red. She stared dazedly at the scarlet rays streaming in through an arched opening. Thick furs encased her, and the ground rattled beneath. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, she frantically wiggled her arms to sit upright, but her limbs felt weighted like water-soaked cotton. Groaning, she managed to haul herself up. Her groggy mind slowly began to recount the moments before she had passed out. She stumbled onto all fours and crawled toward the canvas opening to look outside. A dusky plane bathed in twilight glided past. Finally grasping that she was in a wagon, Maxie cried out in despair. How long had she been unconscious? Fear and confusion roiled within her, and she glanced left and right. She crawled closer to the end of the wagon as if to leap out. They came to an abrupt halt. Maxie glared through her tears at the head that poked through the canvas. You're awake, Ruth said with a drawn-out sigh. She glowered at him for his betrayal, then asked in a choked voice, how long? Have I been unconscious? You've been out cold for a day and a half. Her eyes widened at how much time had passed. She focused her strength on her wobbling legs and tried to get up, but Ruth hastily rushed over and pushed her back down. You must lay down. That demented paladin paralyzed you with magic. Your body needs time to regain function completely. A lot of it, at that. Paralyzed? Maxie parroted. Though she had guessed as much, she still could not believe he had gone this. Ruth seemed equally as shocked. He lightly gritted his teeth and said, and he knocked the living daylights out of you. He overdid it, though, presumably because he's only ever used the spell on monsters. It is why it's taken this long for you to wake up. Before she could protest, Ruth pushed her back onto the bedroll. Her feeble limbs did not put up a fight as she helplessly flopped down. She felt drained even from those few minutes of sitting upright. Her emotions, on the other hand, were threatening to burst forth. She feared she would start screaming if she opened her mouth. She was desperately trying to contain herself when an infuriatingly calm voice cut in. You should have her eat something, seeing as she's awake. We've only been feeding her wine, so she will be weak from hunger. Maxie met Gual's head with a glare, which only glanced off his wall of apathy. He stepped in and handed Ruth a bowl. Have her eat this for now. The wind mage prepared it. He said it was mandrago soup. Maxie's tight rein over her emotions slipped when he turned around to leave. Why, you have absolutely no right to do this to me. Gual turned his head to regard her. One gave my word to protect the mages of the tower. I had no choice but to stop you from recklessly throwing your life away. What nonsense. Did you not abandon Sidina, Master Geoffrey, and Master Alburn at the drop of a hat? Which is why I had to prevent any more casualties, Gual replied, his tone callously indifferent. I don't want to put myself through that ever again. She squeezed her eyes shut. She frightened him, he had told her. Why had words failed her back then? Why had she been unable to tell him she would never leave him again? That she would not be able to bear it a second time either? Now, she might never get the chance to. A groan escaped her as she clutched her head. She silently argued with herself. That was not possible. He had promised to return unharmed, so he would surely come back to her without a scratch. No matter how many times she repeated this, it did not seem to dissolve her worry. Almost there. Nevin's voice snapped Maxie out of her thoughts. She jerked her head up and craned her neck out of the wagon to look ahead. A dazzling white rock face towered over them. She anxiously wet her lips. The Ream Dragon Knights would surely rush to the monster base to help Riftan, but there was no assurance that he and the others were still alive. Maxie promptly threw away the thought and mumbled under her breath as if to hypnotize her mind into obeying. Riftan was the dragon slayer. He had to be safe. Something must have happened to keep him from returning. The wagon soon came to a stop. As Maxie stumbled out, she spotted a figure striding toward them. Whoever it was moved with a supple grace that belied their hulking frame. Her eyes widened. It was Hebarin. He had come all the way from the ruins while they had been away. Hebarin's large, sharp eyes swept over Ruth, Maxie, Nevin, and the temple. Nights before landing on Quail. "Where did you leave the others?" "They failed to return," Quail replied matter-of-factly as he dismounted. Though Maxie would have gladly watched Hebarin punch the man, the knight merely folded his arms over his muscular chest and cocked an eyebrow. After a long moment, he tipped his head toward the tent. "Why don't we head inside so you can explain?" Slightly disappointed by his calmness, Maxie trudged toward the tent. Ruth fell into step beside her, supporting her arm. "Did that cleric take you for an ogre? How strong a spell did he use on you two?" I can walk on my own," Maxie said, stubbornly pushing his arm away and ducking into the tent. She loathed feeling like a helpless child. As she teetered inside, Annette greeted her with a knitting of her bushy brows. "Are you hurt?" Maxie's eyes prickled with tears of joy at the sight of her friend. Immediately sensing something was wrong, Annette leapt to her feet and hurried over. "What's happened?" She glanced questioningly at Ruth and Nevin, who had entered behind Maxie. "Where is Sedina? And Master Geoffrey? Master Alburn?" Nevin's despondent look was all the answer Annette needed. Her face turned grave. "Under the oak tree." Chapter 303. "What on earth happened?" said Annette. "Don't tell me the others are." "I was just asking about that," Hebarin said from his perch on an empty liquor cask. His barbed look landed on Quail Leon as the paladin entered the tent. Shrugging out of his damp coat, Quail handed it to the temple knight behind him and settled across from Hebarin. He was about to launch into his explanation when Calto, Selric, and Miriam burst in. Their faces were pale, having already heard about their companions who had not returned. "It would seem they ran into trouble," Calto remarked after sweeping his solemn gaze over those gathered in the tent. In the span of a few days, the elder's face had become gaunt. Though he was now nothing but skin and bone, his dignified manner was the same as ever. When he lowered himself in front of the fire, silently demanding an explanation, Quail began a monotonous account of events. The temple knight's bland tone infuriated Maxie to the point of having to keep herself from screaming. Though she knew he had done the right thing, she could not help but resent the man's calmness. Riftan, Ulysseon, Sedina, and the other mages were trapped somewhere near the monster city. Had he shown even a sliver of guilt or hesitation, she would not have been so incensed. After glaring at Quail, Maxie bit her lip and hung her head. The sight must have tugged at Annette's heart, as she made Maxie sit by the fire and draped a blanket over her shoulders. Until then, Miriam had been wrapped in patient silence. "How could you return without the others?" she burst out. "Shouldn't you have gone to their aid when they didn't return on the agreed day? And endanger those remaining?" Quail retorted, looking at Nevin and Maxie. Maxie sprang to her feet, ready to bellow at the man to stop pretending he had done this for them. A wave of exhaustion barreled into her out of nowhere, and she sank onto her chair. She clutched her forehead as dizziness blurred her vision. Hebarin's calm voice cut in, "Do you think the monsters discovered the scout party?" "We cannot discount the possibility," Quail replied bluntly. "If they have, they will start a search around the city. We left many tracks during the investigation, and while we did our best to cover them, they may see through it if we're unlucky. At worst, they might chance upon us here. Then we must leave at once," Hebarin muttered, stroking his heavily bearded cheek. Taken aback by his cold response, Maxie turned her head to him. She had expected him to declare a rescue mission for Riftan and Ulysseon. Lost for words, she was opening and closing her mouth when Miriam spoke. "I can't believe this. You want us to abandon the others? And you call yourselves knights?" "Watch your tongue," Kyle Hager, Hebarin's aide, warned frostily. "Our commander is among the missing, so why would we not want to find him? Leaning his brawny form toward the paladin, Baron angrily shot back, us heading back like this comes with its own risks. If the monsters have twigged our presence, they will prepare their city for an invasion. That would make this war a hell of a lot more difficult. We must at least send a team to monitor the monsters' movements. We will think of a solution as befits the situation at the time. Stay here, and we lose all advantage. All the information we've gathered will be lost, and the Western continent will be left helpless against an invading monster army. Then we will divide the party. All eyes flew to Calto. The elder swept his gaze over their faces and solemnly continued, both sides have a point. It is crucial we keep monitoring the monsters' movements and safely inform the church of our findings. Finding out the fate of the scout party is likewise a priority. I propose we go our separate ways. Half of us to deliver our findings, the other half to remain here. But our provisions. The returning group will have to come back with a supply contingent. Calto cut Selric off, raising his chin. Please go to the nearest city and bring back supplies as soon as possible. The rest of us will remain to monitor the monsters and search for the scout party. Of course, if our presence has been discovered, we will have to leave. Let us decide on the route now to ensure that we cross paths should we need to turn back. Quail weighed Calto's suggestion. Praying silently, Maxie kept her eyes fixed on his lips. Soon, the temple knight sighed. Very well. We will divide the party. The group promptly made preparations to leave. With the possibility of discovery looming over them, they decided it would be safest to depart as soon as possible. The mages of the tower stowed all of their records on a baggage wagon, and the knights swiftly dismantled the tent and the stable. While everyone was occupied, Quail and Baron sat across from each other to divide the provisions. The task was not without friction. Their heated voices floated over from time to time. Removed from the bustle of activity, Maxie merely stared out at the snow-covered hill. Icy wind blasted her from all sides, but she did not feel the cold. In fact, she felt as though she were being roasted alive. Though Baron's optimism had given her a glimmer of hope, the situation was still dire. She kept staring over the snowy plain despite the eye-drying cold. Clasping her hands in prayer, she squeezed her eyes shut. Her body felt numb with anguish. I should have fought to go with him. She should have never agreed to be separated from him. After all, she had become a mage in order to stand at his side. Someone who could be of use to him, that was who she wished to be. Not someone who needed protection. She wanted to break free of this crippling anxiety and fight beside him in any way possible, no matter how inadequate her skills. She wanted to face every danger with him, even if he did not wish it. Maxie bit her lip as tears flowed down her cheeks. She hastily wiped them away, fighting back the sobs that rose in her throat. Though Riftan had told her he would do anything to be with her, his version of that sentiment excluded any moment of hardship. He stubbornly kept her from the slightest hint of danger, insisting on tackling it by himself. All he wanted to share with her were peaceful, pleasant moments. But suffering and sorrow were parts of life as well, and Maxie wanted to live all aspects of it together. Whirling away, she fought to keep the tears from welling past her bloodshot eyes. She could not lose him like this. Not ever. Under the oak tree. Chapter 304. Maxie strode to the tent where the mages were hard at work. She sat down and immediately began packing alongside them. Could I have a moment, my lady? Baron's voice called from behind. He dramatically feigned terror when Maxie eyed him warily. I've yet to say a word. I already know what you are going to say, Sir Baron, she replied, her tone prickly. If I were to hazard a guess, you want me to join the returning party instead of staying behind to potential danger. I am used to such treatment from you and the others. All you knights see me as a helpless damsel and a nuisance. But have you considered this? I've always done my part, and I once made a significant contribution. Yet, you men continue to push me to rear. Well, I refuse. I have already obtained Master Calto's permission to remain, and there is nothing you can do to stop me, Sir Heba. Whoa. Please, my lady. He appeared genuinely flustered. Taking a step back, he continued, hear me out before you judge. Maxie squinted at him and raised her chin in a haughty tilt, daring him to speak openly. Baron scratched the back of his head with a sigh. As far as the commander is concerned, your safety matters above all else. I don't think he could bear it if anything were to happen to you. That goes for me as well, Maxie replied, her voice quivering. If I were in danger, Riftan would risk everything to come to my rescue. So why? Would you think I'd be any different? If something happened to him? Her voice began to crack. It would not do to collapse into a pitiful puddle of tears in front of these knights. She whirled away, bringing an end to the conversation, and pretended to tie the straps of her bag. A low groan issued behind her. I understand. When Maxie turned back to look at Baron, her eyes full of suspicion, the knight shrugged and added, as you pointed out, I have no authority to stop you. But I still had to try. His lips curled into a mischievous grin. I endeavored to dissuade you, my lady, so you must come to my defense when the commander tries to murder me. I'm confident your temper will have even. Riftan lips cowering in fear. I am in no mood for jests, Maxie said coldly before looking away. Despite her curt reply, his teasing manner did lift her spirits somewhat. She found comfort in his conviction that Riftan was safe. Before long, Baron and Kuao Lian's deliberation reached a conclusion. About 30 knights would remain while the rest would leave for Ethlana Castle. When the time came to decide who would go to the monster base, Maxie emphatically put herself forward for the position. To her relief, Baron merely heaved a resigned sigh with no further objections. Kalto spoke as they were making their selection among the mages. I would like to go this time. A snort came from the corner. So we can bury your corpse on the way? Jeered Ruth. Consider your age, you old owl. The elder's long cane came down on his nephew's head. Afterward, he turned to Kuao and spoke with firm resolve. My stamina may not compare to the younger ones, but you cannot deny that I am the most powerful mage here. My presence will be indispensable in times of crisis. Kuao regarded the elder carefully before nodding. Soon, Kalto, Ruth, Maxie, and 2 senior mages of Kabbalah mounted their horses. Though others had insisted on going, their limited resources could only allow so many members. Why am I always passed up while a weakling like Maximilian is selected twice? Miriam complained, scuffing her boot in frustration. Because you're dispensable, Nevin teased. Why take you when there are senior mages from Kabbalah who know what you know and more? Miriam flashed Nevin a burning glare before storming out of the tent. Under normal circumstances, Maxie would have been delighted to see Miriam put in her place, but she was currently incapable of feeling pleasure. Relieved, Maxie hopped on Ram and trotted to the ravine. Now familiar with the path, the party traveled much faster than the first time around. Still, it felt too slow. They had been riding for a while when Baron abruptly stopped his horse to sniff the air. I smell blood. Reining his mount in, Kuao furrowed his brow, his eyes sweeping the area. A monster? With a stench like this? Most likely, Baron replied, reaching for the hilt of the claymore slung across his back. Hunching her shoulders, Maxie nervously peered ahead through the ravine. Ruth was in the middle of a search spell, his hands raised in the air. I do sense life not far from here, he said, but I can't be certain if it's human or monster. We should go check, said Kuao. Ruth nodded and led the way. Maxie nervously wet her lips. Her head was a jumble of nerves, fear, hope, and anxiety. If Riftan's party were on their way back after meeting up with Elliot, there was a chance they would come upon them. After all, they would surely opt for the fastest route as well. They might need help, Lucan, a mage of Kabbalah, muttered out of nowhere. The mage carefully studied a rock, a grave expression etched across his thin, serious face. When Maxie followed his gaze, she quickly grasped the reason for his comment. The surface of the rock was visibly scorched. There was a skirmish here, and quite recently at that. Baron's face twisted slightly at Lucan's observation. The knight spurred his horse and galloped through the ravine. Soon, they came upon a steep slope made of stacked rocks, and Maxie maneuvered Rem over the uneven path with surprising prowess. They had gone quite far along when they spotted a thick, elongated scaly tail. Maxie drew a sharp breath. Squashed beneath a pile of rocks was a worm, dark blood spilling from its mouth. A fresh kill, Kuao commented, looking down at the monster grimly. The fact that they left without disposing of the corpse means they were unable to use divine magic. We must hurry. Allow me to search the area, said Kalto, stepping forward on his horse. Maxie scrambled to slide off Rem first. Let me help you. She placed both hands on the ground and allowed her mana to flow into the earth. Her senses felt nothing in return. As she was anxiously gnawing her lip, Baron called out from near the worm carcass, "There's no need for that." They went this way. Maxie leapt to her feet and rushed over. There was a narrow path strewn with rocks, along with blood spatters and hoof marks. Baron cussed under his breath. It's not like the commander to leave such a trail. Which means they couldn't stop to cover their tracks, surmised Quile. After staring at their faces in horror, Maxie hastily mounted her horse. He Baron started down the trail, and she frantically galloped after him, gasping for air. She stopped breathing altogether when she spotted riderless horses gathered next to a jagged boulder up ahead. Talon was among the exhausted steeds slumped on the ground. For a brief moment, her head spun with relief. Before anyone could stop her, Maxie leapt off Rem and beeline to the boulder. As she got close, she saw a cave concealed behind it. Whiffs of smoke spiraled out of the shadowed entrance. Without hesitating, she sprinted inside. Something pounced on her in the dark. She gasped as she hit the ground. Something large and heavy pinned her down, and the cool touch of steel pressed against the back of her neck. Maxie looked up in terror, vaguely making out the chiseled features of her attacker. His face went bone white, so much so that it was stark against the gloom. Eyes wide in disbelief, Riftan withdrew his dagger. Under the oak tree. Chapter 305. My God, what are you doing here? Maxie could not stop staring at him. Riftan seemed just as stunned as he helped her to her feet. Did I hurt you? His gauntlet dug painfully into her skin as his large hand gripped her shoulder. Jolted back to her senses, she swept her eyes over him from head to toe. Her vision turned misty as tears began to well. She carefully took in his powerful frame, black eyes round with surprise, the cold expression across his dark features, and disheveled hair. Her lips quivered, and she threw herself into his arms. Riftan stood stone still. A second later, his arms snaked around her. All the tension in her body seemed to dissolve at once. Flattening herself against his breastplate, she felt her thin thread of self-control snap, and she burst into sobs. What on earth happened? Do you have any idea how worried I was? There's no need for that now. I'm fine. With his arms still wrapped around her, Riftan began to rock her gently back and forth. Maxie looked up through her tears to study his face. He seemed to have lost weight, and the sight of his unshaven jaw tore at her heart. Are you hurt anywhere? There was a trail of blood. I think that belongs to someone else. Startled by the dry comment, Maxie whipped her head around to see Ruth standing in the cave. He looked about with a grim expression. She followed his gaze and froze when her eyes landed on the figure lying in the dark. Ulysses. Was it a monster? Leon strode into the cave. The light he summoned pushed back the shadows, revealing a sight that left Maxie speechless. Practically none of the missing party members were in good shape. Ulysses was slumped against the cave wall, his face deathly pale. Kneeling beside him, a blood-soaked Elliot was tending to his wound. On the other side, Sidina lay bound with a rope, with a temple knight pinning her to the ground. Maxie stood frozen in shock. Are you going to keep standing there? Come help. Jeffrey's urgent call snapped her out of her daze, and she left Riftan standing at the entrance to rush over to the others. She was at a loss for what to do. As she was dithering, Ruth pushed her aside to crouch next to Ulysses. He appears to be under a Lamia's hex. Aimia? An abominable monster that can take over a human mind, explained Elliot. Once bitten, its venom deprives a person of their will, turning them into beasts. A trained knight can resist it, but... His eyes moved to Sidina. It slows their movements and paralyzes their muscles instead. He is in this state because he continued to fight despite his condition. Elliot bound Ulysses' arm with a torn piece of cloth. Maxie regarded the older knight in surprise. She had never seen him look so grave or his eyes so full of concern. He pressed on Ulysses' wound, where his shoulder armor joined his breastplate, and yelled over to Ruth. We need healing. The bleeding won't stop. Max. I need you here. This fellow is badly wounded as well. Removing the glove from Sidina's hand, Ruth placed his hand on her elemental rune and allowed his mana to flow into her. After some time, a faint smile formed on his lips. There is no need for concern. Everything is as it should be. Relieved, Maxie placed a blanket over her friend. When the barley porridge was ready, the group gathered around the fire to eat. Quile and Baron scoured the area near the cave with their subordinates, returning later with no news of monster. Baron testily clicked his tongue. Lamias, was it? There's no sign of them, but we left a few traps just in case. He seemed to be back to his old self, his tone detached. Traps won't be enough, said Riftan, pouring himself more wine. He furrowed his brow and pointed his chin toward Ruth. Cast a barrier around the cave to alert us immediately if anything approaches. Grumbling, Ruth got to his feet and left the cave. By the time he returned, Quail had run out of patience. "I would like to hear your explanation now," he said irritably. "Your failure to return on time has disrupted our plans in all sorts of ways. What was so important that you had to press on knowing the dangers?" Maxie shot daggers at the temple knight. She was about to snap at him when Alburn, who had been focused on his bowl of porridge thus far, spoke up. "I was the one who insisted we continue. Sir Riftan only did his best to keep us safe." Quail's piercing eyes seemed to bore through the mage. Bits of porridge dotted Alburn's mouth and chin, evidence of how hungrily he had wolfed down his meal. He wiped it with his sleeve and continued, "We were running out of provisions, but I could not turn back. Not when I knew doing so could lead to grave problems later." Quail's eyes glinted. "Did you find something in the city?" Alburn hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It was while scouting the city with magic. I found a wyvern breeding farm with over 100 of the creatures." Silence fell over the cave at his revelation. "That is until," Ruth snorted. "The monster army is keeping them captive with magic," said the sorcerer. "We found a basilisk breeding farm in the mountains, likely similar to yours, where the creatures were only confined because their magic was suppressed. I'm sure those wyverns are being bred in the same way." "You're wrong. The monster army had complete control over the wyverns. We even witnessed several training sessions. We had to figure out how the monsters were controlling them." "Don't tell me you infiltrated the city?" Ruth exclaimed. Maxie was equally horrified. Seeing their reactions, Riftan scowled and said, "Do you not grasp the seriousness of the matter? Imagine dozens of wyverns attacking from the air, under the absolute control of their monster master. And did you forget that we are planning a siege? Our forces would be decimated with an above-ground attack while we're out in the open, surrounding the city. If those accursed dark mages are also in the mix, the result would be more disastrous still. We have no chance of winning this war if we don't find a solution." But, don't knights hunt wyverns?" Riftan narrowed his eyes at Maxie and shook his head. "A hunt is different from a battlefield. While we'd only deal with one species of monster during a hunt, in a war, we'd face trolls, ogres, goblins, and those slippery dark mages. If well-trained wyverns were to join the fray, we would not stand a chance." "And? Were you able to find out how the wyverns are being controlled?" Quail asked sharply. It was Alburn who answered. "We copied the runes inscribed inside the breeding farm. We should know more once we've analyzed them." He pulled out a stack of parchments from the leather bag he kept at his side. The mage's eyes gleamed with interest, and they flocked around him to peer at the parchment. Maxie followed suit, standing on her toes to get a better look over his shoulder. Under the oak tree. Chapter 306. Ruth snatched the parchments from Alburn before Maxie could get a proper glimpse. "You shameless dog!" Alburn fumed, leaping to his feet. "How dare you take those from me? Oh, give it a rest. It's not like I'll piss on them. Don't test me. Do you have any idea the trouble I went to copy those? I won't have the deserter reap the fruits of my labor." His face red with rage, Alburn snatched the parchments back. Ruth glowered sullenly at him. "Aren't we supposed to study the runes to figure out how to negate them? I should think I would be our best bet." Alburn snorted as he rolled up the parchments and shoved them into his bag. "Why would I ask for the help of a man who abandoned the tower, saying he couldn't bear to waste away his life on research? Especially when there are others who have dedicated their lives to this very cause without once doubting their commitments." Knowing that they had ventured into an unfavorable topic, Ruth snapped his mouth closed and slunk off to a corner. After watching him go with disapproval, Calto turned to Alburn and Geoffrey. "You have done a tremendous deed, of which I am proud. But I must ask, how on earth did you infiltrate the monster city undetected?" "We used an illusion spell," Geoffrey replied with a proud grin. "It came to mind when Sir Riftan asked if there was some kind of magic to trick monsters. The wyvern farm is located in the middle of a rocky mountain connected to the castle, and we found a tunnel leading out of the city for the disposal of wyvern excrement. That's when we decided to sneak in. Of course, we studied the layout with magic first. It was certainly a high-risk plan," Alburn said. "An illusion allows us to trick a monster's eyes, but, as you know, it's difficult to deceive all their senses. That's why it required so many steps before we got in, and it's why we took so long." He baron-eyed the mage quizzically. "How exactly did you fool the monsters?" "By a rather gruesome method." A strange expression that was neither scowl nor smile rose on Alburn's face. His eyes darted to Riftan. The commander of the Ream Dragon Knights, however, appeared uninterested in the conversation. He was standing with him, chomping on a piece of jerky. When he showed no inclination to elaborate, Albern smiled wryly and recounted their plan. We first sneaked up the rock face to gauge how many monsters were managing the farm and how many were guarding the ramparts. 15 or so trolls took turns guarding during the day, and werewolves regularly patrolled the walls at night. We waited until nightfall and seized a werewolf. Then we, Albern hesitated, skinned the monster so we could wear its pelt. Noises of disgust erupted from those listening. Maxie made a face. I believe I know whose idea that was, Quail muttered, eyeing Riftan cynically. Albern nodded. It was Sir Riftan's idea. As you all know, werewolf fur has a distinct stench. Sir Riftan believed the illusion spell plan would work so long as we masked our scent, and he was quite right. Lost in titillating pleasure, Maxie pulled her husband even closer. Every time he gently sucked on her tongue, her lower abdomen tightened, and her breasts grew taut. She watched him remove his gloves. Slipping his fingers inside her coat, he began to caress her. Maxie writhed. She was burning up despite the cold that seeped through her clothes. Why didn't you leave for Atlanta? Riftan mumbled as he finally broke free of their kiss. She looked at him in surprise. His eyes were grim, and she caught a hint of anger in them. The heat that had engulfed her cooled instantly. Are you admonishing me for coming to find you? There was no reason for you to come. Staring at him incredulously, her face flushed with anger. She shoved his chest. I can't believe this. He leaned back but maintained his grip on her. She glowered at him, incensed, and started pounding his chest with her fists. Do you know how worried I was? After putting me through such distress, that's all you have to? Scowling, Riftan grabbed her arms, which only fanned her rage. Unable to use her upper body, she kicked his shin. To her great frustration, he did not even bat an eyelid as if he had anticipated the assault. He shoved his thigh between her legs, restraining her even more. I am at my limit, he growled into her ear. How much more must I tolerate? Didn't that gruesome scene in the cave knock some sense into you? Or does your stubbornness come from your failure to understand just how much danger we are in? I wouldn't have needed to take such a risk. If you had arrived at the agreed-upon date. Riftan let out an incredulous laugh as if Maxie coming to his rescue was a ridiculous notion. She felt something snap within her. Why are you looking at me like that? Do you not take on dangerous tasks all the time? Your last mission was no different. Who in their right mind infiltrates a city rife with monsters? Yet you still think you have the right to criticize me? Do you hear yourself right now? I am a knight. It is my duty to face danger. And I am a mage. It is my duty to help the fool who rushes headlong into danger. Under the oak tree. Chapter 307. A crimson flush rose on Riftan's face. He brought his head down to hers and gritted his teeth. Are you done? Maxie did not back down, glaring right back at him. I am not. You are the most obstinate person alive. Obstinate? He gaped at her as if doubting his ears. You're calling me obstinate? He shot back, his voice rising. You? That's right. I called you obstinate. What of it? Riftan's face contorted at her defiant glare before he exploded in anger. That's rich. You're as stubborn as a muley. When have I ever succeeded in bending your will? Maxie faltered. It occurred to her then that she had always done what she wanted, whether Riftan approved or not. Still, she could not bring herself to meekly admit it. That goes for you as well, she yelled, refusing to be placated. You've always declined my offers of help. Whenever I wanted to do something for you, you would always look thoroughly displeased before shooting me down. I understood your rejection in the past. After all, I was not competent, and you had more talented people around you. But I am now officially a mage. And still you refuse to acknowledge me. That's not true. Riftan argued back. Had I not acknowledged you as a mage, I would never have allowed you to come to this accursed land. You have no idea. No idea how difficult it is for me to see you starving, sleeping in the dirt, shivering from the cold. It made me feel wretched, but I kept silent. It took all my patience not to interfere. The muscles in his broad neck twitched as he spat each word. All I want is for my wife to live an easier life. My greatest desire is to leave this treacherous place at once. Is that such a sin? I don't want to hide away by myself. To live in comfort while do you not see that I care for you far more than you do for me? How could I leave? Knowing that my husband is in danger? Her words reverberated through the air. A strange expression twisted Riftan's features as though he could not fathom why someone would be so worried about him. It struck her that perhaps that was the core of their issues. With no one to protect or care for him, Riftan had always had to fend for himself. Even someone as ignorant of worldly matters as Maxie could imagine the kind of treatment he would have received growing up as an orphan of mixed blood. And as he grew older, the likelihood of some kind soul taking him under their wing would have only become slimmer. The idea that someone was worried about his well-being might simply be incomprehensible to him. He was oblivious to how much she cared about him, for his safety and happiness. As soon as she realized this, all the fight drained out of her. Lying with her back to him, she gazed up at the swaying shadows on the cave ceiling. Riftan removed his armor and lay down so that he was up against her back. The heat radiating from his steel-like body seemed to penetrate her blanket and seep into her. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she squeezed them shut as if that would suppress her longing. At first light the next day, Sidina finally came to. She looked about in a daze before her disoriented eyes focused on Calto and Maxie, who were peering down at her in concern. "We're saved," she exclaimed. She sounded so much like herself that Maxie sighed in relief. Though Sidina's body must have been exhausted, her spirit was very much intact. It was not long before she began to prattle on about her experience while eating barley gruel. "Max, you've no idea the amazing adventure I had. Do you know what a lamia's bite feels like? Take a look at this. You see the marks? It bit me right on the nape with its fangs. I felt its cold venom spreading through me, and suddenly, I had this insatiable hunger to destroy everything. Do you think that's how monsters feel? When we return to the Mage Tower, I think I'd like to study the nature of monsters." "Quieter, Sidina," Maxie warned, glancing at the temple knights who were gathering their things. Despite her bout of excited chatter, Sidina had yet to fully regain her senses. She mumbled unintelligibly for some time before falling back asleep. Once it became clear that she would not be able to ride by herself, Hebaron hoisted her onto his mount. By contrast, Ulysseon seemed to have the recuperating powers of a monster. He nimbly hopped onto his warhorse without any assistance. The unconscious temple knight also came to by the time they were ready to set out, allowing them to leave without further delay. Maxie was relieved, to say the least. They were in a race against time. Not only were they running out of food, but an even bigger problem loomed. They were almost out of horse fodder. Starved mounts meant they would not be able to keep going, stranding them in this wasteland of rock and snow. The knights, well aware of this fact, drove the horses on with minimal rest. Though they tried not to show it, Maxie could tell they were anxious. The mages were unusually quiet, a clear sign that they also recognized the dire situation. When they briefly stopped to rest, Calto took charge of watering their steeds. "I think I have healed more horses than humans in this expedition," he muttered. Though the elder readily cast restorative magic on their animals, Maxie had never seen him do the same for himself. Ruth sighed as he cast restorative magic on his uncle. "This is why I told you not to come. You should really think of your age." Too tired to strike back, Caldo merely shot daggers at him. Once the horses were done drinking, the party set off again through the snowy hills. By the time they reached the midway point, Sidina had recovered enough to ride on her own, and their relentless pace got them to the ruins before their provisions ran dry. Maxie clambered down from her horse as soon as she reached the tent. Her buttocks, thighs, and calves felt as though they had hardened into lumps of iron. Her face, battered by the wind all day long, stung as if burned. Seeing her staggering, Riftan supported her with one arm. "Are you all right?" he asked brusquely. Feeling too drained to put up an act, Maxie shook her head. Riftan entrusted their horses to the knights who had rushed out to greet them, then strode into the tent with Maxie in tow. He laid her down next to a brazier. The other mages filed in and began dropping to the ground as well. Hebaron shook his head as he looked down at their sprawled figures. "One guess we won't be heading to Ethlana Castle today." Maxie looked up at him in horror. Were the knights planning to ride to Ethlana the very same day? Their situation was certainly urgent, but they had been stuck in their saddles, foregoing eat or sleep. Had it been possible, she would have wanted nothing more than to remain perfectly still for at least the next few days. Under the oak tree. Chapter 308. "Are we in such a rush that we cannot spare a night?" said Riftan. An ambiguous expression rose on Hebaron's face. After silently assessing his vice commander, Riftan rose to his feet. "I'm going to inspect the camp and find out our exact situation." Maxie sighed as she watched him stride out of the tent. She doubted he would listen to any pleas for him to rest. Before long, the mages who had remained at the ruins entered through the tent canvas. They cast restorative magic over the returning party members, and Maxie gained just enough energy to move around. She used it mostly on filling her stomach with the food the knights brought in. Afterward, she drew water from the hot spring and stumbled into the small tent at the reservoir's edge. As she began to wash, waves of drowsiness from the food and warm scrub down began to crash over her. After slipping into a fresh set of clothes, she returned to her tent. Soon, crouched in front of the brazier, she began to nod off. "I overheard the knights talking earlier," said Annette, who was beside her stoking the flames with a poker. "We are to spend the night here and leave the plateau at first light. That means our task is done. What I want to know is, what will you do next, Max?" Maxie's eyes snapped open, all drowsiness evaporating in an instant. "Excluding those that just returned, Master Selric, Master Nevin, and I are the only mages staying behind," Annette added. "The rest have gone to Athlana Castle with our findings. The senior mages will no doubt want to get the documents to the tower as soon as possible, so I think many will head to Nornae then. Are you going back to Nornae too, Annette?" "I'm still mulling over it." Maxie's eyes grew widened at the unexpected answer. Pulling her gaze away from the fire, Annette turned to her with a serious expression. "The Temple Knights will assemble a coalition army as soon as we return. I think Miriam is set on joining, and she doesn't appear to be the only one. Though I'm sure for different reasons. In any case, I'm seriously considering whether or not to join myself. I had assumed you would return. You did say you wouldn't care if this land went up in flames." Annette gave a twisted smile as she picked up on the hint of cynicism in Maxie's voice. "Those are my honest feelings on the matter, but what we've discovered here has only made me want to know more about the Dark Mages. Which is why I'm thinking of volunteering for the rear support unit. If I'm in the coalition army, I'll get to examine the books and magical devices inside the city once we've. Do you think the church would allow that? They certainly won't like it." Annette furrowed her brow, her eyes darting to the side of the tent where Calto and Selric were talking. "I think that's why the mages aboard are considering joining the coalition as commanding officers. Our help will be indispensable in battle against the Dark Mages, so even the Basilica of Ossuria would have to let us participate as a key unit." Ruth sighed deeply as he cast restorative magic on the slumped horses. "We can only do so much with just magic. They won't last much longer without food." "How far are we from Athlana?" said Riftan. "Even if we move with all haste, it will take 5 days," Qua'al replied calmly. "Then let us hope the supply party reaches us in the next 2, Riftan said through gritted teeth before urging his horse onward. Despite their hopes, the supply party did not turn up even as they neared the ravine. In the end, the horses pulling the wagon were the first to collapse, foam spilling from their mouths. Flustered, the mages tried to revive them with restorative magic, but the animals did not move. At a loss for what to do, Maxie looked up at Riftan. What should we do now?" "Discard any unnecessary items. Load only the food and coal on your saddles. We will leave the wagon." Qua'al shook his head. "The horses can't carry any more. Nor can we afford to discard the food," Riftan retorted firmly, leaping down from Talon. "We'll let the horses carry the load while we travel on foot. It shouldn't be long before we come upon the supply party. We've only to press on until then." Qua'al seemed to weigh the options as he swept his gaze over the horses. He soon nodded. The party promptly dismounted and had the horses carry as much of their remaining supplies as possible. There was only enough room for the essentials. Though the empty wine barrels could be smashed apart for firewood, they could not afford the additional weight. Taking nothing other than food, coal, and bedrolls, the party started their trek through the narrow ravine. Fierce winds battered them, and snow fell in flurries. Maxie gloomily looked up. It seemed the terrible weather was upon them again after a sunny few days. All of a sudden, Riftan drew his sword. Ready for battle. Maxie hastily pulled on Rem's reins and retreated to the rear. The flurries intensified, and they were quickly engulfed in a white haze. Maxie's eyes widened at the sight of a shadowy figure in the blizzard. An enormous beast, at least 10 cavets, approximately 3 meters, tall, prowled along the ravine floor toward them. A Fenrir. Summon a barrier. Before Riftan even finished giving his command, Maxie called up a barrier in front of them. The Temple Knights flung their chains to bind the monster, and the knights on the front line charged at it with their swords at the ready. In an unbelievable feat of agility, the monster climbed up the rock face with incredible speed. The weight of its hulking body dislodged a protruding rock, sending it hurtling down. When the knights scattered out of harm's way, the Fenrir seized the chance to strike again. Riftan was about to swing his sword at the massive beast when a thunderbolt struck it from above. Maxie was stunned. The violent squall instantly died down as the Fenrir's body crashed to the ground. As the sky cleared, she realized it was not a bolt of lightning that had struck the monster but a long, gilded spear. After dazedly blinking at the Fenrir's lifeless form, she slowly raised her head and looked up. Knights dotted the edge of the rock face above the ravine. They wore purple surcoats over dark armor, and a banner bearing a red lion billowed above their heads. Maxie had seen that coat of arms before. She was staring at the lion, trying to recall which order it belonged to, when one of the darkly armored knights raised his visor. "Greetings, friends," bellowed an unexpectedly cheery voice. "It appears we've arrived in the nick of time." Under the oak tree. Chapter 309. Maxie squinted up at the knight silhouetted against the sun. Though she could not make out any details, she could tell he was fairly youthful. Quail sheathed his sword and said coolly, "Is it the Bolos misfit?" She looked at the paladin in puzzlement before realizing he was referring to Levadan's knightly order. Lifting her head toward the ravine's edge once again, she caught the darkly armored knight's jaunty wave. The knight lowered his visor and called out, "I'll be right down, so look after my spear, will you?" He nimbly leapt onto his large, gray warhorse and nodded to his men. There must have been a path on the other side of the rock face, as the Bolos royal knights soon retreated from the edge and disappeared. "I did not expect Sir Sigulu himself," Elliot remarked, walking up next to Riftan with his horse in tow. "Sir Sigulu?" Ulysses exclaimed. "The Sigulu Aran, Levadan's greatest knight?" Not bothering with a reply, Riftan yanked the gilded spear from the Fenrir's neck and passed it to Heberan. The weapon reached an entire cavette, approximately 30 centimeters, above the burly knight's head. Heberan pursed his lips in a silent whistle as he inspected the bloody tip. "You have to hand it to the man, his aim is always true." "We should move further along," Riftan said, turning to Quail. "Bringing the wagons down here will be a task." The paladin gave a curt nod of assent before ordering his men. "Dispose of the carcass." The temple knights used their divine magic to burn the Fenrir's corpse. As the smell of scorched lean meat filled the ravine, an intense hunger rolled through Maxie's stomach. She scowled in self-disgust. Even if she were not in her right mind from starving all day, she could not believe that the stench of a burning corpse could rouse her appetite. Appalled, she tore her gaze away. Once they had reduced the monster to ashes, the group led their overworked horses through the ravine. After a while, the narrow passage widened into an area large enough to set up camp, and they promptly stopped to rest. The royal knights of Levadan appeared one by one from the other end. Maxie breathed a long sigh of relief. The supply party was here. "It's been a while, Riftan." The knight leading the supply party hopped from his horse and strode over. Maxie was crouched on the ground, patting Ram's neck. She peered curiously up at the man. His strapping physique rivaled that of her husband's. He removed his helmet and held it on his side before genially resting a hand on Riftan's shoulder. "You had me worried when you went and disappeared in the Pamela Plateau. Though it appears my concern was highly unnecessary. You look fine, Sir Riftan. Gallingly so." "I apologize for being unscathed," Riftan replied, brusquely shoving the man's hand away. Sir Sigulu did not seem to mind the Ream-Dragon Knight commander's frosty response. He grinned and handed his helmet to his squire behind him. "I must admit, I'm happy to see you despite your testy manner. Surely that's a testament to just how worried I was." Maxie grew wide-eyed at their familiar banter. As Sigulu turned his head to take in the others, she was able to get a better look at him. Sigulu gave her a gentle smile as though he had expected as much. "I am honored to make your acquaintance, Lady Calypso. Your loveliness exceeds my expectations." As soon as Maxie's cheeks flared into a deep blush, Riftan moved like lightning. He pried Sigulu's hand off hers. "That's a hell of a long greeting." Sigulu slowly got to his feet. "I was merely expressing my admiration for Lady Calypso's bravery." He then turned to Maxie with a deferential expression. "Forgive me if I've breached some Wedonian proprietary, my lady. It was not my intention to offend." Please do not apologize, sir. Your manners were impeccable," Maxie replied, hastily shaking her hands. His eyes crinkled gently. "That is a relief." Riftan was still beside them, observing their interaction. Running out of patience, he snarled, "I've had enough of your smirking, so I'd appreciate it if you would take your leave." Maxie scowled at his rudeness, but Sigulu merely shrugged as though he knew it well. Your jealousy is unnecessary, Commander. As is the hostility. I would never do something as despicable as seducing a man's wife. A flush crept up Riftan's neck. It is because I'm sick of your insolent face. It saddens me to hear that my attractive visage makes you so uneasy, teased Sejulu, smirking. Growing more incensed, Riftan stepped forward as if to swing his fist. Baron intervened just in time. Let's stop this childish squabbling, eh? We've only just reunited. Come now, both of you. Let's not waste our breaths. Sejulu backed away in an exaggerated show of decorum. Maxie's lips tugged into a smile. She had to admit, she was quite fond of the man's brazen manner toward Riftan. Though mischievous, his words and actions indicated he held Riftan in high regard. You seem to have taken a liking to him, Riftan said after studying her expression for a moment. She ducked her head to hide her smile. As Sejulu had pointed out, her husband was jealous. Maxie pretended not to notice. I was just a little surprised, that's all. I didn't know someone so courteous and well-mannered could reach the rank of commander of a knightly order. Bending down, Riftan asked in a low voice, what's that supposed to mean? Maxie batted her eyelashes at him, feigning innocence. What do you think? He narrowed his eyes. Just as he was about to lash out, there was a bustle of activity as the Bolos royal knights began distributing food. She clambered up. It could not be a more timely interruption. She settled close to the brazier and relished every bite of the thick, greasy ham, thinly chopped onions, soft bread, and fruits preserved in honey. It was only after she had sated her hunger that it dawned on her, they had safely gotten out of the Pamela Plateau. Her eyes brimming with tears, she scanned the faces of the people gathered around the fire. She still could not believe they had managed to slip out of that dreadful place with no serious injuries. There certainly had been some nerve-wracking moments, but in the end, they had done it. Her chest swelled with a sense of accomplishment. A content smile curled her lips. In a few days, they would be at Ethelena Castle. Their adventure was coming to an end. Under the oak tree. Chapter 310. Of course, Maxie knew that greater trials awaited them beyond reaching Ethelena Castle. She quickly cast such thoughts from her mind. It was best not to dwell on the coming war at the moment. Soon, she would be sleeping in a room furnished with a bed and a fireplace. That was the only thing she wished to think about for now. Sejulu finished overseeing the tent preparations just as the group was wrapping up their meal. He pulled a chair over to join them around the brazier. So, what do you intend to do now? The party you sent ahead gave me a brief account of your findings, and I must say, it sounds grim indeed. Do you have a plan in mind? Quoyle was oiling his sword a short distance away. He regarded the Lividonian commander as though he were a small insect. I would think the answer is obvious. Try using that head of yours for once. Do you think we would have carried out such an expedition without a plan? Sejulu shook his head at Quoyle's prickly response. How is it that you grow grouchier by the day? I wager it's because the previous pope worked you too hard. A lack of leisure can really make a person bullheaded. Quoyle's hand froze. His eyes bore into Sejulu. The previous pope? Silence reigned over those present around the brazier. The knights halted their conversations, and the ravenous mages stopped stuffing their mouths with food. All eyes were trained on Sejulu. Wasn't the next papal conclave supposed to be held in the coming Aquarius, the season of water, equivalent to spring? Riftan asked, knitting his brows. It was brought forward because of His Holiness Pope Elphias's failing health. It caused quite the stir across the Seven Kingdoms. After recovering from the shock, Maxie studied Quoyle's face and those of the other paladins. They did not appear particularly shaken, almost as if they had been anticipating as much. And the result? Said Quoyle, breaking his pensive stare into the fireplace. The High Priest Cassius is now our new pope. Visible relief flashed on the faces of the mages. Enjoying their reaction, Sejulu gave a dramatic pause before continuing. The High Priest Garrus frankly had the worst luck. He had even put on a lavish banquet to garner supporters. But as you know, Paxias, the season of repose, equivalent to winter, arrived earlier than usual this year, and many a noble suffered from a poor harvest. In particular, the northern nobles. Staunch supporters of the Orthodox Church, as you know, but few wanted to antagonize the merchants loyal to the Reformed Church by actively supporting the opposition. That is glad tidings for us, Selric mumbled. Then, embarrassed he had spoken aloud, he added, but, of course, it is a travesty that people are suffering from food shortages. The problem is not as serious as you might think. I heard that wheat imported from Lakazam was distributed among the afflicted regions. Still, the situation effectively tied the hands of any clerics supporting the Orthodox Church. Riftan stared into the fire, appearing to be deep in thought. This means we can prepare for the war, he said abruptly, without worrying about the Orthodox faction gaining power. My lady. You're back. She smiled and turned toward an excited Garo rushing over to them. Both the Ream Dragon and Temple Knights began to trickle in. While the others exchanged greetings, Maxi dismounted and stood close to Riftan. In an almost automatic response, he slung an arm around her shoulders as he warily scanned the courtyard. Are there rooms we can rest in? Of course, said Sejulu. The eastern wing was reconstructed last year. Follow the Livadonian commander entrusted his mount to a servant and led them into the main castle. Maxi stuck close behind Riftan as they ascended the stone steps into the spacious hall. Only 3 stories of the main castle had been restored so far. Though it was rather noisy because of the ongoing construction, the interior was well decorated. They walked across the glistening marble tiles to the passageway on the left side of the hall that led to the finished part of the castle. A middle-aged man who appeared to be the steward rushed over to greet them. You have returned, my lord. I have indeed. Are the rooms in order for our guests? The steward quickly counted their number and nodded. Yes, my lord. Show the ladies to their rooms and provide them a warm bath. Have the servants heat the sauna as well. When Sejulu turned to Maxi, his eyes crinkling in good humor, Riftan barked irritably, How long are you going to keep us standing here? Sejulu chuckled as he led the men upstairs, and Maxi sighed deeply. He was determined to get on Riftan's nerves, it seemed. He had been showering her with excessive kindness throughout the journey back, causing Riftan to become increasingly short-tempered. It had now built to the point where her husband would growl like a wild dog every time the Livadonian commander so much as looked her way. Ladies, please follow me. The rooms will have to be shared as we are short on beds. Will that be all right? Of course. Sidina replied. Her voice filled with longing as she said, a clean bed will be more than enough. The steward smiled and led the women up the opposite staircase. Soon, Maxi found herself in a tidy room with a crackling fireplace. Annette had chosen to share a room with Miriam, so it was Sidina and Maxi in the other. When Sidina tried to dive straight into the bed, Maxi grabbed the girl and made her remove her dirty coat and boots first. She then threw off her own filthy clothes. As they filled the laundry hamper with numerous layers of tunics and leggings, the maidservants brought a tub of steaming water. The two drew lots to decide who would bathe first, and Maxi luckily won the honor. She disappeared behind the partition and whistled blissfully as she relished the hot water. Meanwhile, Sidina sat grumbling before the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket. Had I known this would happen, I would have chosen to wash at the sauna as well. At least my eyes would have had something to feast on. Maxi directed a glare around the edge of the partition. It appeared the Lamia's bite had made her friend lewder than ever. Stepping out of the bath, Maxi dried herself with a towel and threw on a clean tunic. Stop that nonsense and get in the bath. I'm all done. Yes, yes. Partway through flinging aside her clothes, Sidina turned to look at Maxi in confusion. By the way, why are you sharing a room with me and not Sir Riftan? Under the oak tree. Chapter 311. Maxi froze. There was a moment of awkward silence. Then she coughed and strapped a belt to her waist, saying, The servants here have no idea that I'm his wife. They must have assumed I would be staying with the other mages. Then you should have told them you wished to share a room with your husband. I had felt rather inappropriate. And I'm here not as Lady Calypso but as a mage of the tower. I thought it proper that I stay with you. When Sidina only gave a bleary-eyed look in response, Maxi stammered, Besides, it would have been unseemly to suggest such a thing. When Riftan himself didn't seem to mind the arrangement. What sort of bollocks is that? Sidina shook her head incredulously as she lowered herself into the water. You're husband and wife. It's only natural that you two share a room. I didn't mention it before, but I always thought it odd that you slept in separate tents throughout the expedition. Not noticing Maxi's flushed face, Sidina kept going, splashing bath water as she talked. You really are an odd couple. You care about each other so fervently, yet you keep your interactions as dry as sawdust. I have to say, your quarrels are quite heated, but then you go right back to tiptoeing around each other. We've been apart for 3 years. We simply need time to readjust, Maxi mumbled, looking embarrassed. And it's more that our reunion occurred under unusual circumstances. There was more splashing as Sidina was preoccupied with her bath. When the girl said nothing for a while, Maxie began to open up. To tell you the truth, Riftan was against my going to the Mage Tower. We had a huge argument over it, and now we're lost on how to act around each other. I guessed as much, said Sidina. She pushed the partition aside and added, but you want to reconcile, don't you? 00 of course. Then all the more reason for you to share a room. You're headed nowhere if you keep this up. Be it to talk with words or with your bodies, what you two need is some private time together. Sidina waggled her finger as she talked. Maxie blushed at her friend's lewdness before the absurdity of taking marital advice from an unmarried young lady set in. She eyed Sidina skeptically. We would only start yelling at each other again. If we're alone, Maxie said, her tone sullen. Of course, arguing was not the only thing they did when they found themselves alone, but she had no intention of sharing such intimate details. She sat curled on a chair before the fireplace and pressed her face to her knees. Sidina heaved a sigh as she worked her hair into a soapy lather. Then try talking with your bodies first. There's no better balm for relationship troubles between a man and a woman. And how exactly do you know that, Sidina? It's what the books all say. Maxie looked skeptical. From my experience, intimacy doesn't solve every problem. Well, it would still be better than staying as you are now. I'm amazed you managed to build such a grand bath, Baron muttered with a languid sigh. Atlanta Castle was all but ruins when we left. Sichulu, who was lounging in the tub opposite, grinned. I paid the greatest attention here when we started restorations. You've no idea how much the parish cleric lambasted me for choosing to build the sauna before the chapel. Ulysseon was next to him, happily stuffing his mouth with food. He paused to ask, speaking of, where are all the paladins? Sichulu shrugged. They've gone to see the parish cleric. Those fellows wouldn't know what rest was if it hit them in the face. Riftan removed the towel he had placed over his eyes to glance at Sichulu. Do you think they plan to contact Asuria straight away? The temple knights who arrived first have already sent word to Belborn, so they've probably gone to hear more about the papal conclave. After staring pensively at the water droplets on the ceiling, Riftan bent forward to rest his elbow on his knee. He scooped water with his other hand to scrub his neck and shoulder, feeling the accumulated fatigue dragging down his limbs. Wiping the water from his eyes, he asked in a slightly hoarse voice, have you learned anything about the undead? I looked into the matter as soon as I got your message, and I think you were right. Someone is intentionally creating those ghastly creatures. I've yet to identify the culprit, though. Whoever it is managed to leave no trace. Sichulu's expression took on a grim edge as he continued, I think it's safe to say that my theory about the remnants of the monster army running amok over the continent was wrong. I'm certain that it's only a small number that are secretly creating these undead. Could a small monster unit raise a whole village? Ulysseon countered. Sichulu's brow crinkled slightly as he rubbed his temple. The villages that were attacked were small, with no defenses to speak of. Not to mention, this mysterious foe is also capable of magic. They did not stand a chance. Riftan furrowed his brow. If the Lividonian commander was right, that meant the dark mages were roaming the western continent, leaving nightmarish undead creatures in their wake. Their capacity to mingle with humans without raising suspicion would explain how the monster army knew each kingdom's internal affairs. They could have easily collected information disguised as servants or merchants delivering goods. It was clear now. There was nothing the Seven Kingdoms could do to keep the formation of the human coalition army a secret. I wonder how far they are, Riftan muttered. Sichulu looked at him quizzically. What do you mean? The bastards roaming the continent creating more undead. I wonder how far they are from the monster base. We have a greater chance of victory if we strike before they return to the Pamela Plateau with news of our invasion. To be sure, Sichulu replied, nodding in understanding. I've been keeping a record of the places where the undead have spawned. We should be able to narrow down their location with that information. What good will that do when it will take weeks for the Council of the Seven Kingdoms to convene? Baron said dryly, picking up his goblet of ale. No beings are slower to take action than royalty, as you well know. I can already see them procrastinating until Aquarius. Sichulu gave him a wry smile. Have you already forgotten about our new pope? The rulers of each kingdom are already assembled in Asuria to celebrate his appointment. They will no doubt convene as soon as they get the news. Riftan frowned. Something told him that all of this was part of a carefully calculated plan. Under the oak tree. Chapter 312. Riftan was certain that the church had been preparing for this war for some time. The question was, since when? He recalled how, after the Great War 3 years ago, the Temple Knights had remained in the north to pursue the scattered monster army. Had they known about the existence of dark mages or the monster city all along? Had they hidden this truth all for the sake of preserving what influence they had left? The Reformed Church would undoubtedly come under fire if that were the case. After the monster invasion, many in the ravaged northern regions had turned to the Orthodox Church. The resulting weakening of the Reformed Church's power would have alarmed the Pope greatly. The thought had no sooner formed in Riftan's mind than he realized he was jumping to conclusions. He furrowed his brow. He had yet to find any substantial evidence to prove his suspicions. Impatiently sweeping back the strands pricking his eyes, he turned to Sejulu. How long will it take to assemble an army? Sejulu popped a dried plum into his mouth, appearing deep in thought. It's hard to say. It all depends on how firmly the new pope takes the helm. Still, we should have an army before the season ends. Elliot, who had so far remained silent, shifted in his tub. Should we send word to Sir Ursuline? Riftan shook his head. We cannot leave Anatole unmanned. King Reuben will likely send an army, so one see no need for us to gather additional men. I concur, Hebaron said, his voice booming over the tubs. We don't need that fellow. Our assault unit can do the job just fine without him. Ulysses snorted, his cheek bulging from the food he had stuffed in his mouth. How can you be so confident? The lad gulped and swiped his lips with a towel. If you recall, you almost used your arm in the last war. If it weren't for her ladyship, you would be a ghoul by now, Sir Hebaron. Hebaron's face twisted into an angry scowl. You runt. How long are you going to keep bringing that up? Sir Ursuline has commanded me to speak of it as often as possible. That bloody be. Quiet, Riftan muttered in a warning tone. Hebaron promptly closed his mouth. Ulysses' expression grew troubled as if worried he had committed a terrible mistake. Ignoring his men's reactions, Riftan scooped bathwater onto his face, scrubbing irritably. It still made his bejude run cold whenever he thought back to the surprise attack on Athlena Castle. He grabbed the long cloth he had hung on the wall and rose from the tub. I'm going to rest now. Let us leave talk of the undead spawning to tomorrow. As you wish, Sejulu murmured. Riftan wrapped the cloth around his waist and made his way to the chamber connected to the sauna. The servants working the bellows rushed over to attend to him. He irritably waved a hand to dismiss them, walking to the long table in front of the fireplace where neat piles of linen and clean clothes had been laid out. Do you have anything that would fur me? As he sat cursing himself, Maxie stirred at the cool draft that brushed past. Summoning all of his self-control, he pulled the blanket over her shoulder. Then, forcing himself up, he walked away to throw a log into the fire. He could feel the pent-up sexual energy as a vice grip on his muscles. He perched on the chair and breathed a tired sigh. Outside, dozens of baggage wagons rolled through the castle gate. Maxie had been translating a passage of ancient text onto parchment. She walked over to a window and craned her neck out for a better view. Soldiers rushed to the wagons, and when they removed the leather hides covering the load, hundreds of spears and crossbows came spilling out. Her heart sank. It had only been 5 days since they had arrived at Athlena Castle, but the knights were already preparing for war. They spent most of their time in the W-tar room discussing strategy or overseeing drills at the training grounds. Meanwhile, the mages immersed themselves in deciphering the records left by the Dark Mages. Half of their findings were said to be sent to the Mage Tower at the earliest opportunity, but Maxie doubted that the Temple Knights would allow it without a fight. Come look at this! Annette exclaimed, rushing into the room. She placed a stack of parchments on one of the desks. This record recounts the history of the Dark Mages in detail. 1. Maxie stopped searching for Ream Dragon Knight armor out the window and approached the desk. Annette excitedly picked up one of the parchments. See this? It tells of how they ended up settling in the Pamela Plateau. There is a similar story here as well, 11 Maxie said, pointing to the record she was translating. Annette huffed and vigorously shook her head. You idiot, this is completely different. It explains why they left the ruins and moved to the monster city. This seemed to catch the interest of some of the senior mages gathered around the desk opposite, deciphering runes. They stopped yanking at their hair and walked over to Annette. What does it say? One Geoffrey asked, his eyes twinkling with interest. There was apparently a rift among them. Between the hidden Kahid factions, which one assume are names. The two sides fought, forcing one to leave the ruins. That's it? That's barely anything, Royald said, shrugging. We already assumed as much. There was evidence of a battle all over the ruins, and some devices in Ray Cave were for defense against magical attack. He arrogantly waggled his finger and added, "It likely means there was a violent extremist among the dark mages." "You weren't even the one who uncovered it," Miriam said coldly from her perch on Ray windowsill. "Stop acting so smug. It was all Master Anton and Master Elena. It's nothing but speculation so far, but we may learn the details if we translate this record," one Annette remarked, remaining confident in her discovery. Maxie's reaction was tepid. "Our priority should be to come up with strategies to attack Ray Monster Base. Shouldn't we concentrate on figuring out how the monsters are controlling the wyverns first?" 1. The mages are working hard to make sense of that rune as we speak. "It's a task beyond our capabilities anyway," Annette retorted flatly. Then she arched a brow. "Have you decided to participate in the war?" "I intend to discuss it with my husband. When he is not so busy," Maxie grumbled as she pulled back a chair for herself. Sedina, who had been dozing off on the desk, burst into giggles. "Are you still upset over last night? All that effort sneaking in, and he made no attempt to touch you. Oh, do shut up." Under the oak tree. Chapter 313. Maxie's acidic tone did not stop Sedina's cackling. She glared at her friend, then stomped on her boot under the desk. "Ow. There's no need to get physical. You never listen to me otherwise," Maxie shot back sullenly. Feeling peeved, she plucked her quill from its inkpot to continue working. 10 minutes later, however, she had not written a thing. She blew away the strand of hair that had slipped onto her forehead, recalling this morning's mortification and sense of rejection. The glass or two of wine she had downed to calm her nerves while waiting for Riftan had gone straight to her head. When she had come to her senses again, she was sprawled naked on the bed, bathed in the morning sun. Riftan had been getting ready to leave after having prepared a wash basin for her by the fireplace. Seeing her in the throes of a hangover, he had poured her a cup of Kojadi water and left the room after a terse warning to drink in moderation. His cold, almost indifferent manner had left her shocked. They had been separated for 3 years before reuniting under life-threatening circumstances. By then, there were so many accumulated emotions that the tension between them was inevitable. Still, she had thought some of it would have been resolved by now. Having believed they would be able to reconcile after this journey, her disappointment was beyond words. She bitterly vowed never again to let such strong liquor touch her lips. As she sat silently scolding herself, Anton burst through the door. "Gather around, everyone." The mages looked at him inquiringly before lowering their parchments. They surrounded Anton as he flopped onto the long couch beside the fireplace. He heaved a sigh. "We have finally reached an agreement with the Temple Knights. The Mage Tower will officially join the war effort. Should you be making a decision like this without consulting the elders?" Ben, a senior mage of Undame, asked. It was a question fitting of his cautious personality. Anton nodded. Master Cairo was given full authority on this matter. Before we departed, the head designated him as his proxy, and the elders supported the decision. "Will Ray Tower deploy more mages?" Deep lines creased Anton's forehead at Miriam's question. He stroked his well-groomed gray beard and said, "We would if we could, but one doubt the coalition army would wait for them to get here. One think the knights intend to depart for the monster city as soon as the troops are assembled." Maxie bit her lip. Anton scanned the mages' grim faces before continuing in a measured tone. "Of course, it would likely take more than half a month to finish all the necessary preparations, but it would take longer for the mages of the tower to get to Ethlena. Hence Master Kalto has decided to assemble the free mages currently in the north. We have already sent out a notification through the Mercenary Guild. We're hoping to recruit as many as possible." Despite the hope shining in Anton's eyes, the others exchanged skeptical glances. Noting their reluctance, Anton added with a sigh, "The mages who join the coalition will be handsomely rewarded. They will be allowed to study the records of the Dark Mages before anyone, as well as granted private workshops on the upper floors of Ord upon their return. Those who wish to remain active outside of Nornai will be paid no less than 8 dinar, with additional compensation depending on the difficulty of the task." The mages began to murmur among themselves. After glancing around in bewilderment, Maxie whispered in Sidina's ear, "Is 8 dinar a lot?" He was upon them in the blink of an eye. "I will tend to my wife," he said, snatching her hand from Sejulu's. "You go check the equipment. The merchants are waiting for you to sign the receipt. Worry not. My aide is more than capable of handling such duties," assured Sejulu. Then, grinning, he said, Aren't you supposed to be attending the strategy meeting? Riftan glowered as if he very much wanted to smack the man. He hissed through gritted teeth, one can spare a moment. How surprising. One had thought you too busy to spare even a second to talk to me, Maxie said sullenly, retracting her hand. Riftan's head whipped to her from where Maxie stood, golden sunlight shone in a halo around his face. The sight momentarily weakened her resolve. He had always been a breathtakingly beautiful man, but as he aged, he had begun to mask his rough, impatient side behind this frightening self-control. It gave him a certain mature charm. But Maxie was not happy with his restraint at all. It riled her that this man who had once burned with desire for her now acted like a cleric. A part of her feared that he no longer found her as desirable. Wanting to shake his resolve, she said coldly, Sir Sajulu has offered to escort me, so you needn't concern yourself. Riftan leaned in and whispered dangerously, Are you telling me you wish to be alone with him? 1. Sajulu raised his hand in exasperation. There are at least 400 soldiers here. It would be impossible for us to be alone. And as I've reminded you countless times, I am a man of honor. I'm flattered by how highly you appraise my charm, but think you overreacting. You be quiet, Riftan said menacingly. Maxie arched an eyebrow at him. Why you mustn't be so rude. Sir Sajulu is merely being kind. That's right, one was trying to help this lovely lady, Sajulu chimed in. Riftan gave him a murderous glare. One suggest you shut your trap before one rip that mouth of yours off. Riftan's face grew red with anger, and he gave each of them a glare. A moment. Jader, he raked back his hair and barked, Fine, do as you please. With that, he marched away. Sajulu shook his head as he watched him go. One think we've truly angered him. How would you like to proceed, Lady Calypso? After a moment of indecision, Maxie raised her chin in a determined tilt. She was tired of being the only one fretting and chasing after him. Putting on a haughty air, she said, What else? We'll go see Ruth as one intended. Can one still rely on you to take me to the assembly room, sir? It would be my pleasure, my lady. 1. Grinning, Sajulu held out his hand and escorted her away. Under the oak tree. Chapter 314. It did not take long for Maxie to regret missing her chance to be alone with Riftan. The image of him turning away in anger refused to leave her mind. In the end, she glanced over her shoulder as they reached the barracks entrance, but he was nowhere to be seen. You must be concerned about him, Sajulu Aran said, genially leaning toward her. There was a mischievous twinkle in his hazel eyes. Maxie gave him a stern look. You seem to find us amusing, Sir Sajulu. Apologies if I've caused offense, my lady, Sajulu replied with mock remorse. It pleases me so much to see that chum expressing actual human emotion that I'm unable to stop teasing him. Maxie looked up at him, perplexed. She found it intriguing that he still thought well of Riftan despite her husband's shocking rudeness. Are you and Riftan close? She asked cautiously. I should like to think so, but I doubt he'd agree. A small smile tugged at Sajulu's lips. I first met your husband 10 years ago at a swordsmanship tournament in the West. He was still the vice commander of the Ream Dragon Knights back then. I initiated conversation because I wanted to size up the fellow who had won the knight's sword, but before I knew it, we'd gotten into a heated argument. Maxie's eyes widened. Sajulu grinned. My past self was rather coarse too. Having been spoiled all my life, I lacked patience, and my growing fame as a knight made me terribly proud. So, you can understand how infuriated I was when your husband openly ignored me. I was the one who acted like a child and picked a fight. Maxie frowned reprovingly. Seeing her expression, Sajulu sheepishly scratched his cheek. I know now how shameful my actions were. Both of you must have made quite the impression on each other. So how is it that you hold him in such high regard? Many things have happened since. Sajulu's eyes crinkled ever so slightly, and Maxie could not tell if he was frowning or smiling. Your husband completely crushed my ego in that tournament. It was the first defeat of my life. They had entered the barracks and were now climbing a flight of stairs. A series of wide, arched windows were built into the stone walls. Silver sunlight poured through, along with the occasional brisk winter breeze. Sajulu positioned himself nearer the windows as they walked, blocking the draft. That incident proved beneficial for me. It allowed me to lend humility after being shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not, in fact, the best. Soon after, one was tasked WTTH forming a joint raid party with him. Admitting defeat allowed me to admire HT's talent as a knight objectively. He is a man endowed with many admirable qualities. He stopped in front of a wooden door and turned to her. Though, I admit, I still find it difficult to appreciate his foul mouth. Having nothing to say to that, Maxie gave an awkward laugh. Ruth raised an eyebrow as though the answer was obvious. Of course. Even if Sir Riftan does not wish it, the king will command him to battle. Maxie bit her lip. After studying her pensive face, the sorcerer said abruptly, "What do you intend to do, my lady?" When Maxie looked up at him in surprise, Ruth folded his arms. "It seems to me that Sir Riftan wants to have you escorted back to Anatole." Maxie's face hardened. With whose permission? How could he decide such a thing without even? I said that he wishes it, not that he intends to do it, Ruth said, raising a hand at her rising voice. Sir Riftan also seems to be agonizing over what to do. Under the circumstances, no travel is safe, and with your penchant for the unpredictable. Soon after angrily opening her mouth to retort, Maxie sheepishly pressed her lips together, recalling the numerous times he had caught her wayward actions. Ruth sighed deeply. "So, you do intend to participate in the war?" I was going to discuss it with Riftan first," Maxie grumbled. Throwing on his coat, Ruth shook his head. "I can already see Sir Riftan's reaction. Still, I should discuss it with him." After throwing a skeptical glance up at the ceiling, Ruth once again let out a long sigh. He started toward the door. "The war with the monsters is not the only battle we have to look forward to, then. I shall endeavor to stay away from Sir Riftan for the next few days." Though Maxie shot daggers after him, her shoulders slumped weakly as the truth in his statement hit home. True to Ruth's predictions, the war preparations progressed swiftly. A few days after their conversation, the royal army of Levaton marched into Ethlana Castle. The following day, Austrian forces entered the city in a long procession. Seeing the castle packed with soldiers made Maxie realize that war truly was looming. She grew restless, wanting more than anything to have a calm conversation with Riftan, but Shikal never seemed to find the right time. The various preparations kept him busy from dawn until the late hours of the night. She was also buried in work, trying to decipher the Dark Mage's records. As the chiffon dragged on, she discovered she was not alone in her frustration. One day, she was hurrying out of the library carrying a stack of reference books for her translation when Riftan blocked her path. "Riftan," she exclaimed, smiling widely. What are you doing here?" "I came to talk to you," he replied curtly, taking the books from her. Maxie's face brightened. I wanted to speak with you as well. I went to see you in your room a few times, but you were always asleep, and one couldn't bring myself to wake. I'm sending some of the Ream Dragon Knights back to Anatole, and I would like you to go with them." Stunned, Maxie stared up at him. Her smile vanished, and she gave him an icy glare. I was told the army would be marching out in a few weeks, yet you would divide one of our main forces at such a critical moment?" His reply was infuriatingly calm. "The royal army of Wedden will be here in a few days. We will have enough men, so I want you to return to Anatole with our knights." Maxie's response was equally smooth despite forcing the words out through her clenched jaw. "Is that an order or a request?" Riftan furrowed his brow at her soft tone. He seemed to mull over his answer for a moment. "Consider it a request." Under the oak tree. Chapter 315. Maxie narrowed her eyes. When she did not go to speak, Riftan said impatiently, "Your answer." She stared down at his blunt toe sabaton before calmly asking, "How many knights will you be sending?" "About 50. Relief flashed across his face, mistakenly taking her question for assent. "Karen will go with you, and I'll hire a maidservant to attend to you during the journey." "Thank you. But I shall have to refuse." "I won't be going back," Maxie replied softly. She plucked her books out of his hands. Riftan's eyebrow twitched. He leaned close, his voice dropping low. "Come again?" I will not be going back." Clutching her books to her chest, she stepped backward. She saw his jaw clench. Before he could say anything, she said quickly, Does it make sense for you to divide your men at such a time?" "Yes, the royal army is coming. But those knights are not loyal to you. You should be consolidating more men under your command, not." He snorted. "Are you trying to instruct me in military affairs?" The look he gave as he gazed down at her, combined with the imperious way he spoke, made him appear infuriatingly arrogant. Maxie lifted her chin. Seeing as you're planning to send seasoned knights away when we are bracing for war, I thought why you needed the advice. His eyes flared with rage. I do not need your advice, he snarled. She felt like a fool for having waited so desperately to talk to him. Turning her back, she stormed out the door and down the corridor, leaving him standing in the library. But as she soon found out, her strides were no match for his long legs. Is this your answer to my humble request? He fell into step beside her. Humble? Maxie looked up at him incredulously, gritting her teeth. Why you, sir? Clearly, you do not know the meaning of the word. Fine. Then, one command it. Go back to Anatole. I refuse. She shrilled. Servants passing through the corridor stopped to watch out of curiosity, but Maxie was far too angry to care about appearances. She glowered at him defiantly and continued marching along. Trailing a few steps behind, Riftan's next words carried a subtle threat. I am your husband. That is surprising, said Maxie, snorting. She quickened her pace. I had assumed you'd forgotten. His lips drawn into a thin line, Riftan seemed to consider it for a second. Then he said brusquely, No, enough of your quibbling. Anywhere would be safer than the battlefield. I will not take you with me to that hell. I also cannot allow you to go to war with little over 100 knights. Angered by his adamant refusal to make any concessions, Maxie shot him an icy glare. The tendons bulged from his strained neck, his voice dropped to a dangerous growl. And how exactly do you intend to stop me? Something within her snapped. She hurled the book in her hands with all her strength. The spine knocked him squarely on the chin, and he stepped back, cursing. Still too angry to feel sorry, she continued to rage, not caring whether anyone was watching. Fine. G, go ahead, D, do as you please. B, because I will do the same. God damn it, Maxie. You unhand me. She jerked her arm free from his grasp and bolted down the corridor. Maxie's immediate next step was to seek out Calto and inform him of her decision to join the coalition army. Calto happily accepted. As it turned out, Annette, Miriam, and Armin had already volunteered. Maxie glanced at Armin Dolph in surprise. She knew Annette's reason for joining, but she had assumed Armin would have chosen to return to Nornai. As if sensing the question in her gaze, Armin shrugged. I am a craftsman just as much as I am a mage. This is a golden opportunity to see all sorts of siege weapons and much more in action. Maxie understood completely. Be it at Calyp's castle or Athena, Armin spent most of his time at the forge. It was also not unusual to find him showing interest in the knight's weapons. What was more surprising, though, was Sidina's decision to stay behind. Despite Geoffrey's relentless attempts to persuade her, she was resolute. I want to stay here and translate these records. I find this task far more interesting at the moment, Sidina explained, pointing to the stack of parchments on the desk. Her iron determination forced Geoffrey to back down. She was not alone in her decision to remain at Athlena Castle. A total of 5 people, including Royald, Joel, Keel, and Elena, opted out. One of the mages aboard chose to stay behind as well. It was a decision made out of necessity, as they would need someone to coordinate the delivery of the records to the Mage Tower. Let's see. That means 13 mages are leaving for the Pamela Plateau. We have contacted the free mages in the north, so around 20 more should respond if we read lucky, Anton said. There had been fewer volunteers than he had hoped, and he seemed somewhat disheartened. I'm glad you decided to join, he continued. Earth mages are rare, so your skills will be invaluable. As I've made clear numerous times, I intend to stay away from any fighting, Annette said with distaste. There were very few Earth-based offensive spells, none of which were particularly strong. It was a wholly inadequate skill set against monsters with astonishing regenerative abilities. Of course, Anton was aware of this. He gave Annette a bitter smile. Indeed, but no matter. You Earth mages are adept at repairing magical devices, not to mention talented at defensive magic. Annette mirrored his smile with a slight curling of her lips. With the participating mages now confirmed, they dove into war preparations. The low mana concentration in the plateau meant that those in the offensive unit would need something to amplify their magic. While they worked to solve that issue, Maxie and Annette procured various medical equipment. Most of the supplies were of southern origin. Having learned early on that healing with magic alone was grossly insufficient, Maxie had studied various treatment methods during her time at the Mage Tower. With the help of Sajulu Aran, she now procured large quantities of alcohol and clean linen for washing and dressing wounds. Other equipment included tools for stitching lacerations, such as needles, thread, scissors, and tweezers. Though she ran into Riftan several times, she gave him the cold shoulder. Riftan had taken to ignoring her as well after learning that she had gone ahead and enlisted. A storm brewed whenever they were in the same place, and the heavy atmosphere seemed to surprise even Sichulu. The Lividonian commander had taken to treading carefully whenever he was around them. The days passed in that manner, and eventually, the coalition army arrived at Ethlana Castle. Maxie was making emergency remedies at the training grounds infirmary when she heard the blast of a copal. Sticking her head out of the window, she saw row upon row of soldiers entering the castle gates. A pair of banners fluttered above them, Wedden's crest of a white bird, and next to it, the Royal Army of Livedon. Under the oak tree. Chapter 316. Maxie's heart sank. A seemingly endless procession of spearmen with dark helmets marched into the castle, followed by archers and cavalrymen. Annette stood next to her on tiptoe to get a better view. "There's got to be at least 6,000 of them," she said, appearing overwhelmed by the sheer size of the army. "Do you see any mages?" asked Ben, a mage of Undame, his thin face full of hope. Maxie carefully scanned the procession entering the training grounds. Dozens of leather-covered wagons rolled in behind the soldiers, followed by high-born knights and their squires. No matter how hard she looked, she could not see any mages among them. It's difficult to tell. There are too many. Maxie trailed off when her scouring eyes caught Riftan walking across the grounds. He wore a navy fur cape draped over silver armor, with the mailcoif bearing the emblem of the Ream Dragon Knights covering his broad shoulders. The sight of his imposing figure made her briefly forget the fraught tension between them. The soldiers hastily opened a path for him as he strode past with long, dignified steps. A few of the knights, squad leaders, Maxie presumed, came forward to introduce themselves. Riftan gave them a curt nod and went straight to the knights bearing the royal arms of Wedden. Seeing him approaching, the slender young man at the head of the group cast off his helmet. "It's been a while, Mago." The youthful knight's voice resounded across the grounds. Maxie's eyes widened. The young man was none other than Princess Agnes, dressed like a page. A breastplate covered her chest, and a sword hung at her waist. "What a surprise! I thought you were in southern Livedon for a campaign," Agnes teased as she hopped down from her warhorse. Maxie could not make out Riftan's reply. Her anxiousness rising, she leaned out the window. Royald, who was peering out next to her, gave a low whistle. "It appears Cabela's very own princess is leading Wedden's army." "Cabela's princess? Isn't that the golden-haired mage you're close with?" Annette asked Maxie. She was referring to the time Princess Agnes had spent a few weeks with Maxie upon first arriving in Norney. Maxie awkwardly bobbed her head. "Yes. That was Princess Agnes. Who recommended me to the Mage Tower. Why not go greet her?" Is everyone going to stay inside?" Maxie looked over the faces of the mages gathered in the infirmary with a puzzled expression. Anton was gazing out at the training grounds through another window. He shook his head weakly. "I think not. I see no other mages, and it's already quite crowded without us getting in the way. Everyone will gather in the hall for supper anyway, so we can make our greetings then." He flicked an apathetic glance at Maxie and added, "You should go, though. She's your acquaintance, I'm sure you would like to say hello. We have enough hands here for the work." Maxie hesitated for a moment, then grabbed her robe. She stepped out of the infirmary into a sea of soldiers. Glancing around, she made a beeline for the billowing banner of her kingdom. Soon, she managed to locate Riftan conversing with Princess Agnes. She halted, silently staring at his back for a moment, and cautiously walked over. The princess's eyes widened as soon as she spotted her. "Heavens, just look who it is." Agnes appeared immensely pleased to see Maxie. Her slender legs swiftly closed the distance between them. Grabbing Maxie's hand, she gushed, "Are you out of Norney already? I can't believe you finished your training in just 3 years. I am so proud." "Hello, Your Highness," Maxie said, taken aback by the ecstatic greeting. Contrary to her expectation that their reunion would be awkward, the princess was no less hospitable than the last time Maxie had seen her. "About the monster city and the involvement of the dark mages." Agnes's face hardened as she asked, "How big is this city?" Maxie hesitated. "It is as big as Belbourne." A groan escaped the princess's mouth. Maxie purposefully avoided mentioning the bizarre magical devices at the ruins or the mysterious runes in breeding farms. Since the commanding officers of the coalition army would soon convene in the war room, she did not wish to trouble the princess so soon after her long journey. "May I ask, how is Rosetta?" said Maxie, changing the subject. Is she well? Agnes's lips split into a warm smile. But of course. She is healthy and doing very well. And Abel grows bigger by the day. Abel? Agnes clicked her tongue. Has no one told you your nephew's name? Abel is Reuben, it is. He is as beautiful as an angel. He has the Reuben eyes, but he mostly takes after the crown princess. Maxie blinked at the pain that shot through her heart. In her mind's eye, she saw an infant, the spitting image of Rosetta. Her face fell as she thought of her own lost child, whom she had no idea was in her womb until it was too late. Perhaps that was why the sadness had been somewhat bearable. If anything, the disappointment of failing to do her duty as a lord's wife had been greater. Terror at being abandoned by Riftan had followed closely after that. Now, a dull ache clenched her chest as she wondered which of them their child would have resembled. She hastily pushed the thought from her mind. No amount of self-torture was going to change anything. She forced a smile. One would very much like to see him one day. Come and visit us at Drakium Castle with Riftan when this war is over. I'm sure the Crown Princess would be happy to see you as well. Maxie's smile turned bitter. She simply could not imagine Rosetta looking happy. Days passed, but no more than 8 mages arrived at Ethelena Castle. Though Kalto tried not to show it, it was clear that he was deeply disappointed. It was too late to ask the tower to send more now. Troops from each kingdom had already assembled, and the coalition army was raring to start the march. Maxie's expression turned anxious as she took in the plethora of weapons that covered the training grounds. Soldiers ran through breach tactics with the siege tower near the wall, and at the opposite end, blacksmiths meticulously inspected an array of large crossbows. Maxie was sweeping her eyes over everything when Annette called over to her. Max. Come help me with this. She turned to find Annette crouched in front of the shield armory, hammering away at something. As she drew close, she saw that her friend was fixing a drake bone onto a sizable board. She inspected the object with interest. What? You are making? It's part of a mantlet. A movable shelter for protection during a siege, essentially. I'm enhancing it with a shield, see? One only need to make about 60 more. S60? Right. An average mantlet wouldn't stand a chance against the brute force of an ogre or a troll, hence the need for a protective rune. Removing her gloves, Annette blew onto her red, blistered hands before handing Maxie a piece of parchment. Use that as a reference. It's Master Selric's draft. They also asked me to inscribe runes on the other siege weapons to make them more durable. Maxie let out a cry of dismay. When will we do all that? We'll just have to do our best, Annette grumbled. This is our unfortunate fate as mages of Gnome Hall. With a heavy sigh, Maxie picked up one of the drake bones on the table. She was trimming it to an appropriate size with a chisel when the blast of a copal sounded from the castle wall. The gates opened to admit an army of gigantic men riding equally large war horses. Annette furrowed her brow. Was there anyone who hadn't arrived? They. SH should be the last. Maxie looked worried when she saw the wolf on the dark green banner. The Knights of Philarin have arrived from Balto. She saw Sajulu Aran leave his post overseeing military drills and make his way to the gate. The knight at the head of the Baltonian party removed his helmet, and Maxie flinched as she recognized his cruel face. It was just as she had feared. Richard Breston, the man who had harassed her during the previous war, was once again at Ethelena Castle. Under the oak tree. Chapter 317. Richard Breston's large, piercing eyes scanned the crowd of soldiers. He haughtily passed his helmet to the knight mounted behind him and hopped off his warhorse. Maxie tugged her hood lower as he walked up to Sajulu Aran. The man held a deep animosity toward Riftan, and the last thing she wanted was to start an altercation by catching his eye. She furtively began gathering her tools. They're all so big, said Annette, her voice tinged with fear. They certainly give that carrot-haired knight a run for his money. I don't think I will ever be able to call you a giant again. They say. The people of the north are descended from Seraphim. A messenger of heaven. Sired a child with a human woman a long time ago. And the Baltonians are supposedly that child's descendants. They look more half-ogre to me. They're practically giants. Maxie sneaked a glance at the Baltonian men. Indeed, the Knights of Philarin looked nothing like the heralds of God. Wolf pelts covered their reddish-black armor, and their backs bristled with heavy swords, battle axes, and iron maces. They appeared closer to ancient barbarian warriors than knights. Her face clouded as she recalled how belligerent these men had been in the past. What would happen to the unity of the coalition army now that they had joined? There you are, my lady. Maxie looked over her shoulder at the familiar voice. Ulysses strode toward her, his long legs making quick work of the distance. Isla regarded her with concern as he approached. I rushed to find you as soon as one saw the Philaran banner. One was worried those northern pigs would try to harass you again. I was just about to leave. One would rather steer clear of them if possible. Of course, my lady. Allow me to carry those for you, he said, taking the drake bone from her hands. Maxie searched the training grounds. Do you know where Riftan? Well, just look who we have here, came a gruff voice. If it isn't the white lizard's pup. Flinching, Maxie looked behind her. Richard Breston, who had been talking with Sejulu Aran by the gate moments ago, was now swaggering toward them. He was likely coming to pick a fight after recognizing the Ream Dragon armor. He halted in front of them, his intimidating gaze settling on Ulysses. Or shall I call you the Mad Dog now? You've become quite notorious. But what else could one expect from Sir Rover's progeny? You should refrain from starting unwelcome conversation, Ulysses said coldly, sending shivers down Maxie's spine. It is no hobby of mine to exchange words with beasts. Bahaha. Still have that temper, I see. The man's hulking body shook as he burst into laughter. Didn't your master teach you not to bark whenever you like? No, but he did teach me how to silence a man who likes to run his mouth. Ulysses' purple eyes glinted as he gripped the hilt of his sword. Leaning down, Breston's smile spread into a wide grin. His voice dropped dangerously low. I'm curious. What did he teach you, little rover? Maxie nervously glanced back and forth at their faces. A moment later, Sejulu Aran placed himself between the two men and gripped Breston's shoulder. Look here, Breston. You only just got here. Are you that desperate for trouble? The Baldonian knight shrugged nonchalantly. You're overreacting. One was simply glad to see my fellow comrade in arms. Give it a rest. You're too old to be going around picking fights, Sejulu said, his voice graver than Maxie had ever heard. Breston's lips twisted. And this coming from you? I remember a time when you'd seek out any brawl you could. I've become more sensible with age, Sejulu said, sighing. I heard you're now the commander of your order. Do try not to tarnish your father's name. Hostility flashed across Breston's face. Maxie held her breath in the tense silence. Very well, he said eventually, nodding. I shall be careful. The tension eased from Maxie's shoulders. Though Breston still looked willful and dangerous, he seemed to have learned some restraint. She furtively tugged at Ulysses' clothes. There is an empty table in the infirmary. I would like to continue my work there. Could you help me move my tools? Ulysses broke his wary glare and released the hilt of his sword. He picked up the tools Maxie indicated and shifted them to his side along with the drake bone. Shall we, my lady? He said, motioning with his head. Relieved, Maxie rolled up her parchment and tucked it under her arm. She then motioned to Annette, who was absent-mindedly watching them from a short distance away. Sejulu let out a groan. How can one stay out of it if we've another war on our hands before the real one has even begun? I'll eat my hat if you two really do resolve this peacefully. Ignoring him, Riftan pulled back the thick leather flap covering the tent's entrance. His gaze landed on the bed covered in expensive throws and furs. A fireplace blazed beside it, with a long table positioned in front. Richard Breston sat at the table enjoying a sumptuous feast of food and drink. He turned his head toward Riftan. Long time no see, Calypse, he said, raising a silver goblet. Though one can't say I'm glad to see you, even as a lie. Without waiting for permission to enter, Riftan strode into the tent and settled across from Breston. The knight filled a second goblet with wine. I hear you're set to be an earl soon. Here, allow me to offer you a drink to celebrate your undue advancement in life. Do you not also have an undue advancement to celebrate? Riftan said, looking at the claymore propped to one side of the tent. The hilt was engraved with a wolf, the symbol of the commander of the Knights of Philaran. Accepting the goblet, Riftan drained it and added dryly, allow me to pour you one for managing to weasel your way into your new position using your father's shining achievements. He picked up the bottle and tipped wine into Breston's goblet. The dark red liquor overflowed, spilling first onto the table and then over Breston's lap. The man's languid demeanor vanished, anger blazing in his eyes. Riftan met his fierce gaze with stony indifference and placed the empty bottle back down. There is a knot between us that needs untangling. I intend to challenge you to a duel once this war is over, so you can stop your childish provocations. Breston said nothing. There are soldiers from all over the Seven Kingdoms gathered here. If you don't want to be ridiculed as the fool who instigates strife, one suggests you proceed with caution. Preston's eyes narrowed. He grabbed a chunk of meat and tore a bite out of it. Chewing, he said in an ominous tone, "I'll keep that in mind." Riftan slowly rose to his feet. Just as he was about to step out of the tent, Preston's voice, gleeful this time, grated on his nerves. "But you see, you must understand something. I didn't talk to that woman to get a rise out of you. I find her bravery fascinating, especially as she's trembling like a leaf all the while. Even if she weren't connected to you, one would still find myself drawn to her." Riftan froze. "Who knows?" Preston added slowly. "She might be a widow by the time this war is over." A heartbeat later, he was no longer smiling. Riftan stood dangerously close to him, his dagger stabbed into the plate between the Baltonian's fingers. The sharp blade had cut clean through into the table beneath. If his aim had been even a little less precise, it would have pierced the back of Preston's hand. In the tense silence that followed, Preston stared at the dagger, his fury rising. He cussed and leapt to his feet. Wrestling the Baltonian back down onto his chair, Riftan held him there by sheer force. He yanked the dagger up and held it under Preston's Adam's apple in one swift movement. Preston's struggling stilled immediately. "Did one not tell you to mind your tongue?" Riftan's chilling voice was at odds with his tranquil gaze. "You did," said Preston. "I've never forgotten the humiliation of that day." His eyes flashed as he bared his teeth. Riftan leaned the tip of his blade closer to his neck. Sensing they had crossed into dangerous waters, Sichuluaran rushed forward. "That's enough. That's enough," he said, regarding Preston coldly. "You'll have plenty of time to settle this after the war. I will even serve as a witness to your duel." Riftan slowly backed away before striding toward the entrance. Acting as though nothing had happened, Preston reached for the meat on his plate. He mumbled as he tore into it, "Then let us both muster our patience. The longer the wait, the sweeter the harvest." Under the oak tree. Chapter 318. With the Baltonian soldiers camping in the training grounds, the mages moved their remedy-making operation to the main castle. Most of the northerners were either staunch followers of the orthodox doctrine or uncivilized people with loose morals. As the mages considered both to be dangerous company, they made every effort to steer clear of them. They enlisted the help of the Livadonian soldiers, who ferried remedy ingredients and magical device components to their workshop set up in the main castle. Knights would also escort the mages whenever they moved about. As it turned out, however, crafting magical devices indoors proved difficult. Maxie looked anxious as she carried the device she had been working on with Annette out to the training grounds. The Baltonian infantry was in the middle of a vigorous drill. Perhaps because she knew most were former convicts, she now found them even more terrifying. She tried not to stare as she scurried to the workshop next to the armory. Finally, "Quick, come help me with this," Armin cried as Maxie and Annette entered. Having spent most of his time cooped up in the castle forge, Armin had enthusiastically rolled up his sleeves to help when work on bolstering the siege weapons had begun. Maxie hurried to him when she saw him struggling to raise a hefty wooden column. Before she could get there, her escort Ulysseon reached him first. The young knight shifted the column upright with ease. Armin dusted off his clothes and gave a disgruntled sigh. "We are severely short on hands. It'd be nice if the other mages helped as well." Maxie shook her head as she placed the magical device made of drake bones on a long table. "Deciphering the dark mage's runes is more pressing. If we do not solve the wyvern problem, it will be a major hurdle in capturing the city." "Have they made any progress?" "No, something about it has them stumped." When Maxie noticed soldiers nearby leaning in to listen, she quickly added, But I'm sure they will figure it out. Master Calto has managed to decipher most of the runes, so I'm certain they'll find a solution soon enough. That problem could be resolved with more help as well," Annette grumbled as she dumped her tools on the ground. "Having a few more mages, even low-ranking ones, would be great. They don't need to be elemental mages to help with the remedies or magical devices." "That is actually a good idea," Maxie mumbled, looking pensive. Most of the tower's mages were under the services of high-ranking nobles. Though there were certainly free mages among them who were under no one's command, the fact that only 10 had shown up at Athlana Castle meant that the rest were unwilling to participate in the war. However, those who did not belong to the tower might be more inclined to volunteer. She had heard that the famine had cast many northerners into poverty, and no doubt there would be mages among them. The promise of compensation and the opportunity to study at the tower could very well entice a few more to join the coalition army. "I'll suggest to Master Calto." That we hire regular mages. Indeed. Master Kalto has not been feeling well, so I will be the mage's representative in his stead. Anton swept his eyes over Maxi, Annette, and Armin. You three should join us. We will need you to explain how the magical devices work. Do you need all three of us? Armin asked, frowning. Anton shook his head. One will suffice. Then you go, Max, Annette said without hesitation. I'd like to avoid mingling with humans as much as possible. Maxi gladly lowered what she was working on. When they entered the barracks, a Livadonian soldier led them to a large hall on the second floor. Maxi cautiously glanced around as she stepped through the arched entrance. A blazing fireplace heated the expansive room. In the middle was a large, circular table, knights representing each kingdom seated around it. Maxi spotted Riftan right away. He was grimly studying a map in the middle. Princess Agnes was next to him, whispering something in his ear. Maxi's brow furrowed subtly. What are you standing there for? Come, sit down. Her frozen legs became unstuck at Miriam's prompting, and she walked over to the table. Only then did Riftan's eyes land on her. She avoided his gaze as she pulled out the chair beside Miriam and sat down. Is everyone here, then? Richard Breston's voice came from the shadows. Maxi flinched. Turning toward him, she saw him reclined in his seat, twirling a dagger. He said impatiently, Can we start this thing now? I'm getting cramps from sitting here being forced to look at the dark face of a damn southerner. I'd appreciate it if we got this over with as quickly as possible. Maxi stiffened, blood rushing to her head in anger at the man's audacity. How dare he insult Riftan so publicly before all the prominent nobles of the Seven Kingdoms? Riftan, however, seemed not to care at all. He calmly spread a parchment over the table. This is the map of the Pamela Plateau we created on our reconnaissance of the region. All eyes were fixed on the map. Riftan unfurled another parchment next to it. And this shows the layout of the monster city. Maxi peered down at the outline. On it was a detailed architectural drawing similar to the ones used by the Masons. The city is enclosed with 70 cavet double ramparts, he continued dryly. As it's located on a slope, there is only one place in the southwest where we can set up the siege towers. He picked up a small model tower at the table's edge and placed it on the map. Under the oak tree. Chapter 319. Sigulu regarded the map in silence, then turned his head to address Quail. We would need an ungodly amount of wood to build siege towers that could take on ramparts that high. Just the task of transporting it to the Pamela Plateau would be grueling. We must take every weapon available, Quail replied, glancing over everyone present with his ever-lifeless eyes. There are magic negators installed on the ramparts, which means it will be difficult to breach the walls with magic. We will have to rely on physical weapons to capture the city. But we already have too much baggage even without the siege towers, said Agnes. Add to that provisions and fodder and we would need more men to transport everything, which means even more provisions. This issue alone poses quite the headache. Richard Breston snickered. What a needless worry. By the end of this war, the mouths that need feeding will have been reduced to half. I assure you, our current supplies are more than enough. Agnes scowled in disdain at the man's callous remark. She was not the only one who found his words contemptible, some of the other knights present also shot daggers at him. Even so, Breston paid no mind to their scornful looks. He picked up the map and swept a half-hearted gaze over it. The report clearly states that around 13,000 monsters currently dwell in this city. Do you expect so little casualty on our side even after hearing such numbers? Is that not too optimistic? I believe you are being too pessimistic, Sigulu retorted stiffly. We should at least try to minimize our casualties. Sir Richard's words may sound harsh. But he has a point, said the middle-aged knight to Breston's right. I also see no need for us to increase our food supply. From the man's attire, Maxi surmised that he must be the commanding officer of the Erexian Spear Unit. The knight turned his head to Guile and added, moreover, the Council of the Seven Kingdoms has already imposed its nobles to pay for this costly war. Demanding more funds from them will be met with resistance. An unfortunate but unavoidable situation if the war drags on, chimed in another knight. He appeared to be higher in rank than the first speaker. We fight to protect the peace of the Seven Kingdoms. It is the Council's duty to provide our army with sufficient supplies however many times we require it. I assure you, you need not worry about supplies being cut off, Quail replied calmly. Still, it would be best to find a way to capture the city as quickly as possible. There are few resources available in the plateau, And there is no guarantee that the supply party will always reach us on time. If the siege becomes drawn out, I've no doubt the council will order a retreat, rendering this campaign a failure. His piercing eyes looked at each face around the table. We must capture the city within half a month. Ludicrous. How are we to capture a fortress surrounded by gigantic high walls in just 15 days? Preston exclaimed with a snort. He began tapping his knife on the map. We are already at a geographical disadvantage. The monsters have the upper hand by being on higher ground. No matter how gentle, a slope is a slope. It'll require twice the effort to move the siege towers, and it'll affect the catapults. And that's not taking into account our enemy's unlimited regenerative abilities. Every attack would leave us with heavy casualties while they heal right up. The monsters will know that time is on their side. Mark my words, they will try to drag this battle out. Anton, who had been listening to the knights in silence thus far, suddenly spoke. A troll's regenerative ability is not unlimited. When all eyes in the room flew to him, the mage lightly cleared his throat and said calmly, trolls heal by using the nutrients stored in their bodies. As such, once the wounds are dealt with, they will be afflicted with extreme hunger. If they were to run out of provisions, they would eventually lose their regenerative abilities, and the hunger would likely drive them into a frenzy. Maxie faltered for a moment before looking him dead in the eye. Considering the size of the catapult and the weight of the projectile, the maximum range should be around 1 radian, approximately 185 meters, Maxie replied, enunciating each word. If you also consider the incline and the height of the ramparts, it would be more effective to station the catapults closer. That range is insufficient, Riftan mumbled, frowning. Maxie was taken aback. Clearly, he had expected more. He seemed to be deep in thought as he brushed his temple. Then he asked matter-of-factly, is there no other way to further improve the strength of the catapults? To minimize casualties, we must place them where the enemy can't reach our men. But there is a limit to how much a magical device can enhance them. Though wood can be reinforced with magic, there is little we can do to strengthen the ropes. The strain that would come from hurling rocks at greater distances would eventually cause them to snap. Rather than risking breakage, we could. Maxie stopped herself. She was afraid of being laughed at for sharing an idea that suddenly sprung to mind. Seeing her hesitation, Riftan brusquely pressed her point. We could what? She studied his expression. How did he feel about her speaking at this meeting? His face did not seem to give anything away. Maxie nervously wet her lips. Wouldn't it be better for us to alter the terrain instead? Alter the terrain? Quail asked, arching an eyebrow. Before anyone could dismiss or scoff at her suggestion, Maxie launched into an explanation. We could elevate the catapults by summoning earth barriers beneath them with magic. That way, we can attack from a greater distance without having to modify the devices any further. But mana concentration in the plateau is low. It would require twice the mana to maintain the barriers. To keep them up, we would need all of the mages focusing on the task, Miriam argued, appearing unconvinced. This was nothing new. During their time at the Mage Tower, Miriam regularly picked holes in her ideas. Now it only filled Maxie with greater determination. A barrier does not require that much mana. Moreover, we wouldn't have to keep them up all day long. We would only have to elevate the ground beneath the catapults while we attack. Not a bad idea, Sichulu murmured. Maxie's face brightened. Agnes had her eyes fixed on the map, turning Maxie's proposal over in her mind. The princess soon nodded in agreement. Under the oak tree. Chapter 320. Offensive magic would be ineffective against the walls, so it would be more practical for the mages to focus on bolstering the weapons, Maxie pointed out, looking at Miriam triumphantly. Her sense of victory was nipped in the bud when Quail remarked dryly, if we do not solve the wyvern problem, it wouldn't matter how much we enhance the catapults. No amount of distance would keep our men safe from an above-ground attack. We will solve that problem in short order, Geoffrey replied. We have deciphered most of the rune. Once we understand how it works, it will only be a matter of time before we figure out how to negate it. However, the mage trailed off, looking troubled. Preston's impatient nature got the better of him. He pressed irritably, however, what? Get on with it, man. Geoffrey frowned, offended by Preston's rudeness, and said curtly, to destroy the rune, one would need to access its mana circuit. There was a pause. That means someone will have to infiltrate the monster city, Riftan muttered. Maxie's back stiffened. Surely he was not considering taking on such a dangerous task? She eyed him warily. The monsters will fortify their defenses once we muster our army, Quail said snarkily. Sneaking in will not be as easy as last time. Riftan raised his chin to look at the paladin, and a cold smile curled his lips before vanishing. It wasn't easy the first time either. Deliberations continued into the night. The knights flung about various military terms, taking turns voicing their opinions. The atmosphere within the hall soon grew heated as one argument after another broke out. Having had enough of the night's battle of nerves, Anton rose from his seat as the servants arrived to light the candles. We shall excuse ourselves now. We still have much to do. Maxie instinctually stood with them, but the sight of Riftan and Princess Agnes seated side by side prevented her from moving further. Seeing her awkwardly frozen in place, Miriam frowned as she headed for the entrance. What are you doing? I understand. I will take the role. Good. Now, all of you, off you go. Go unpack. Everyone dispersed at Anton's instruction. Maxie made her way to the infirmary to gather remedies and medical equipment. To her surprise, the training grounds, previously crowded with the Baltonian knights' tents, were now filled with dozens of wagons and thousands of horses lined in organized rows. She was weaving through them when the sight of Riftan bending over one of the wagons made her freeze. He was dashing in a wine-colored tunic and Ream-Dragon Knight silver breastplate and chainmail, over which he had slung a black fur coat. It vexed Maxie to no end. Biting her lip, she considered giving in and speaking to him first. The fact that he had made absolutely no effort to reconcile was beginning to make her anxious. However, when she saw him straighten from his inspection of a crossbow and turn to Princess Agnes, all thoughts of approaching him first vanished. She glanced back and forth between the two, her eyes narrowed. The pair were like figures in a painting. A slender beauty with dazzling golden locks, and a dashing, raven-haired knight. Maxie felt her heart burn with jealousy. Ever since the princess's arrival at Athlana Castle, they were always together. According to Ulysseon, the royal edict that the princess had brought with her appointed Riftan as the chief aide to the supreme commander of Weden's royal army, the princess herself. They attended strategy meetings together and afterward supervised military training side by side. There was nothing strange about this on the surface. After all, Riftan was a knight who had pledged allegiance to the Wedonian crown. Still, Maxie had the sneaking suspicion King Reuben had not given up his desire to match Riftan and the princess. Quelling her simmering emotions, Maxie whirled around and walked into the infirmary. The mages who were already there were packing vials within the dimly lit space. Though she threw herself into the work, her busy hands did nothing to stop her thoughts from drifting back to Riftan and Princess Agnes. Did he truly feel nothing for her? Even if he did not, the same could not be said for the princess. Maxie scowled, loathing herself for harboring such suspicions. Her head told her there was nothing to be worried about, but her insides still boiled whenever she saw them together. She irritably gnawed her lip and tied the opening of the herbal bag as tightly as she could. It was high time she overcame this feeling of inferiority she felt toward the princess. After all, Agnes had done nothing but support and encourage her up until now. It would be highly ungrateful of her to repay her kindness with such petty jealousy. She took a deep breath. Princess Agnes was not the problem. The real problem was the lack of trust between Riftan and herself. Even so, she could not think of a way to resolve it. Perhaps I'm wishing for too much. She walked over to the window and opened the shutters. Outside, she saw Riftan and Agnes walking through the crowd of soldiers. It was a stifling feeling, this longing to be the one at his side, be it in the safety of the castle or on the battlefield. But all this desire of hers had done was cause a rift between them. One of them would have to relent first. She knew that her resolve was weakening by the day. Her greatest fear was that they would end up no better than strangers if she stubbornly persisted in placing her will above his. Once this war was over, would it be wiser to follow his wishes? She did not wish to antagonize him any further. The next day, 20,000 soldiers marched out of Athlana Castle at first light. The infantry marched at the head of the massive procession, carrying the banners of their respective kingdoms. Behind them rode the cavalry, followed by a train of baggage wagons. As the armies of Ossuria and Balto had gone ahead, the billowing banners still visible were those of Levedon, Weden, the golden banner of the Bolos Royal Knights, and Ream-Dragon Navy Blue. Maxie scanned the crowd as she rode behind the Ream-Dragon Knights. It seemed every inhabitant of the city had flocked to the streets. They waved colorful handkerchiefs, cheering, Rosam Wigrud Daran. Rosam Wigrud Calypse. Peace and victory to the Seven Kingdoms. Under the Oak Tree. Chapter 321. Resounding cheers filled the city. Maxie pacified a snorting Rem by patting her neck. At the same time, she gazed out at the slowly brightening sky beyond the shadowed walls. The light from the rising sun played over the knights' armor, making them glint silver. The gathered crowd looked on in awe, and their exuberant cheers continued until the Ream Dragon and Bolos royal knights rode out of the gate. "Are you not cold, my lady?" Ulysses asked as they reached the steep valley just outside the city. Maxie pulled back her hood and smiled. "I'm fine. I'm dressed quite warmly." In truth, her hands and feet were already freezing, but she did her best not to show it. It had snowed the previous night, and the field around them was covered in frost. Ulysses surveyed the surroundings, his brow furrowed. This year's winter truly is unrelenting. It should be warmer by now. "Isn't it always this cold up north?" said Annette from the baggage wagon beside them. She blew her nose into a handkerchief as if to emphasize her point. Ulysses shook his head. "No, this Paxias has been unusually long. It is strange for it to still feel like the middle of the season when we're 2 months into the new year." Maxie gazed despondently over the wilderness currently being battered by fierce winds. Thick frost blanketed the ground, and the soldiers' breaths rose above their heads like smoke. This winter truly was unrelenting. Adjusting her cloak to cover Rem's rear, Maxie fished out a flask of mulled wine from her saddlebag. The once hot liquid was already tepid from their ride out of the city. "Let me have a sip of that," said Annette. Maxie obliged, stretching her arm out to pass the flask to her friend. She then nudged Rem to keep up with the knights. The cacophony of wheels rolling over frozen soil, thousands of hooves stomping the ground, and the rhythmic marching of soldiers filled the air. She advanced with the army in silence. Before long, the distant figures of the Baldonian and Osirian forces became visible over the gentle slope ahead. The sight of the sloped plain filled with soldiers sent a chill down her spine. There were 12 divisions in the coalition army, each of which comprised thousands of spearmen, archers, and cavalrymen. The units marched in orderly, square formations around wagons loaded with weapons, provisions, and lumber. It was like watching a moving city. "I didn't think we would catch up to them so soon," Maxie said in surprise. Since the two armies had started their march before dawn, she had expected them to be much further ahead. Ulysses looked down at her. "Scouts are sent out first to ensure our course is safe, which takes time." Maxie nodded her understanding. While the soldiers came to a brief halt, she searched the cavalry for Riftan and spotted him just as the march resumed. He was in the middle section advancing up the hill, leading the Ream Dragon Knights and the Wedonian army's cavalry. Her eyes locked on his head of black hair bobbing above the sea of soldiers. A moment later, she noticed Agnes riding next to him. She frowned as irritation surged through her. "Isn't it customary for mages to be stationed at the rear of a unit?" Ulysses looked puzzled by her abrupt question. "Customarily, yes. I ask because I see Princess Agnes riding at the head. Mages who are part of the offense, like Princess Agnes, are sometimes stationed at the front. Mage Ruth often assists Sir Riftan there as well." Maxie was so mortified at her innermost thoughts being laid bare that she found herself mumbling a blatant lie. Actually, I am not that bothered by their relationship." When Ruth merely shrugged, she rode on for a while in silence before blurting, "Even if the princess is oblivious, shouldn't Riftan keep his distance? I don't think the chief aide is required to accompany her at all times, especially with knights from other kingdoms watching. What if they were to spark salacious rumors like last time? I shall go convey this to Sir Riftan, my lady." Ulysses, who had been stoically listening nearby, steered his horse forward. Maxie frantically grabbed his cloak. "Why, you mustn't. But Sir Riftan should know how concerned you are for his honor. I shall be furious with you if you tell him any such thing," she hissed through clenched teeth. Ulysses stared down at her in bewilderment before bobbing his head. After eyeing the young knight doubtfully, she offered a reason that sounded like an excuse even to her ears. "I was only slightly concerned that their reputations might be tarnished. I am in no way jealous or upset by their relationship. So you are not to turn this into a bigger problem than necessary. Do you understand?" Ulysses nodded gravely. "Yes, my lady." Feeling deeply embarrassed, she urged Rem into a trot. The army continued marching, stopping only for short breaks to relieve themselves or water the horses. With half of their forces being foot soldiers, the pace was frustratingly slow. Nevertheless, by sunset, they were almost at the Pamela Plateau. They began setting up camp near a winding gorge cut through by a frozen river. The first thing she did was unsaddle Rem. The mare's head drooped to the ground from exhaustion. After briefly casting restorative magic on her, Maxie led her to the water's edge. Soldiers were already by the riverbank, smashing hammers against the ice and scooping water into pails. Soon, more soldiers arrived with hundreds of horses in tow. Maxie stood in line behind them and waited her turn. Just then, a hand gripped her shoulder. Startled, she turned to find Riftan looking down at her, his face impassive. "We're about to hold a strategy meeting. The mages will be in attendance, so you should come as well." When she continued to stare up at him stupidly, Riftan impatiently took Rem's reins from her and called to one of the soldiers. "Water this horse and have it rest near a fire." When the soldier took the reins from him, Riftan immediately dragged Maxie to a blazing brazier. At his urging, she settled in a seat near the warmth. Joy began to bubble up inside her as the shock wore off. Riftan removed his gauntlets and tossed them to a squire. He picked up a wine bottle from a table the soldiers had laid out. "Drink this for now," he said, pouring some into a cup for her. "The meal will take a while." Thank you," Maxie said, taking the cup. Richard Breston chose that moment to saunter over, an unpleasant smile plastered on his face. He did not say a word and merely placed a chair next to where the knights were putting up barracks. As Breston sat down, Riftan pulled a chair next to Maxie and poured himself wine. One by one, Situluaran, Qual Leon, and Princess Agnes finished inspecting their respective units and joined them around the fire. The high priests of each kingdom came soon after, followed by the mages. Under the oak tree. Chapter 322. The soldiers promptly offered the newcomers seats and wine, and the group huddled close to the brazier to thaw their freezing bodies. Meanwhile, the area around them bustled with activity as the tents went up for the night. Maxie's shoulders eased. With the windbreak in place, it was no longer unbearably cold. Clutching her cold cup, she stole glances at Riftan between sips of wine. He sat in silence, staring into the fire with his elbow resting on his lap. She was debating whether to talk to him when Princess Agnes, who had been discussing something with the Wedonian knights, pulled her chair next to his and began whispering in his ear. Whatever it was clearly gained his attention, for Riftan cocked his head toward the princess. Fiddling with her cup, she repeated Ruth's words in her head. "You are only tormenting yourself. You are only tormenting yourself." They had to be discussing official matters. If she were to display disapproval now, she would only be painting herself as narrow-minded. "You are only tormenting yourself." As she was desperately trying to maintain her silence, Situluaran finished conferring with his men and addressed the person sitting across from him. "Has the scout party returned?" The noisy tent stilled for a moment. "They only sent back a message," Qua'al replied dryly. He continued as he rinsed his hands in a basin brought to him by a young cleric. "Since we will be passing through the ravine tomorrow, they have decided to camp near the entrance to keep watch." Riftan cut short his conversation with Princess Agnes and searched Qua'al's face. "Do you think word has reached the monster city?" The cleric proffered a towel to Qua'al, who wiped his hands on it as he replied with his usual indifference, "It never hurts to be cautious. We currently have no inkling of how the monsters are getting information about the western continent. Though the council has locked down cities all across the land to weed out spies, it is still possible that enemy informants have managed to slip away." "I'd wager that they have," Situlu remarked, raising his cup to his lips. "I doubt that secured gates or heightened inspections would be able to contain the spies' movements. After all, these bastards managed to create ghouls across the 7 kingdoms while avoiding detection. I've been trying to track them down for months with nothing to show for it. They must have a way to deceive humans. How do you suppose the dark mages managed to operate in our city so covertly?" Riftan asked, his eyes fixed on Qua'al. The answer came from the others, each putting forth hypotheses ranging from fake identities, hypnosis, and elaborate concealment spells that could dupe even clerics. Soon, a heated exchange filled the tent. Maxie glanced at Celtic and Anton. The two kept their lips tightly sealed as they watched the commanding officers. They seemed to be considering how much they should share with these people. Gnawing her lip, Maxie thought of the Dark Mage's lineage. Most of those banished to the north were an offshoot of the silver-haired, blue-eyed Serbil clan. Though many Serbils and Nornai lacked these distinctive features after years of intermarriage, the exiled mages would not have had the same chance to dilute their blood. This information could help narrow down the hunt for the spies. Still, she understood why the mages of Ord were reluctant to disclose anything of the sort. It could put the Mage Tower in a difficult position. Moreover, She did not think people with such conspicuous features could mingle unnoticed among the general population anyway. If the dark mages were wandering the Seven Kingdoms in disguise, there was no point in revealing something that would only be detrimental to the Mage Tower and the Reformed Church. While Maxie was absorbed in silent deliberation, Quail said grimly, "It would be prudent to set our strategy with the assumption that the monsters are aware of our movements. One have already marked all the areas they could use as points of ambush, and one would like you all to take note." He motioned to a Nate standing behind him, who moved the brazier aside, dragged a table in its place, and spread a map over it. While the knights of each kingdom pored over the map, soldiers entered the tent with supper. Maxie ate her ration of thick lamb stew cooked with garlic, onion, and nutmeg alongside thinly sliced and toasted wheat bread spread with butter. All she had eaten during the day's ride was dry cotton jerky as hard as tree bark, so the warm food filling her stomach seemed to dissipate her fatigue. "The report on the topography around the city is rather lacking," commented the commander of the Erexian army, stroking his bushy beard. Maxie recalled the burly man's name as Adolf. He carefully studied the map before giving Quail a questioning look. "The route is mapped out, but it lacks information on the surrounding areas. There could easily be more ambush points in the uncharted terrain." "We had neither the men nor the resources to conduct a thorough reconnaissance," Quail replied flatly. "As for the unmapped areas, we can simply send scouts ahead." "That may be so, but shouldn't you have?" "What did you expect?" Riftan cut in irritably. "We are headed into no man's land. You should be grateful we were able to acquire even this much information." Do you also think there is something strange going on between them?" she asked after a while. "This is not the first time I've seen them whispering to each other." "I would not know," he muttered woodenly. "But I do think they are standing inappropriately close." "All right," Maxie agreed heatedly. "Why, you think so too? They are standing needlessly close." Again, Quail only offered silence. What do you think they're discussing?" "To warrant that? As a cleric, don't you think you should reprimand them for such inappropriate behavior?" "If inappropriate behavior is a concern." The paladin trailed off. Only then did Maxie turn her head to look at him. Mortification washed over her as she met his clear, green eyes looking down at her from an uncomfortably close distance. She hastily released her grip. Her cheeks burned as reason returned to her. She mumbled an apology, her voice growing smaller and smaller by the end. Please forgive me. I was." "What are you two doing here?" An icy voice sounded above their heads. Maxie flinched and looked up. Having stealthily approached them, Riftan regarded them with a chilling gaze. Maxie's face fell in despair. How could she possibly wave off her gross breach of decency? She was desperately racking her head for an excuse when Riftan spoke, his voice ominously gentle. "And one not owed an explanation?" "Well. You see," Maxie stammered, rolling her eyes up to think. A second later, she stiffened when she noticed Princess Agnes standing behind him, looking over at them with curiosity. "And what about you and the princess? What were you doing all the way out here?" She observed their reactions through narrowed eyes. Though Riftan did not let anything show, the princess looked dismayed. "I had something to discuss with Sir Riftan in private," Agnes explained awkwardly, scratching her head. Maxie's lips pulled into a thin line before saying coldly, "We also had something to discuss in private." "What could you possibly have to discuss?" Riftan snapped. Flustered, Maxie looked to Quail for help. The paladin sighed. "One needed her to confirm something about the basilisk farm." "Why would that require you to speak to her in a place like this?" "That is none of your concern," the temple knight replied flatly, straightening himself. "She is not a mage under your command, so one do not see why I would require your permission to speak to her." Riftan stiffened, his eyes flaring into a murderous look. Quail calmly turned his back to him to face Maxie. "Shall we take our discussion elsewhere?" he said politely. Maxie, who had been anxiously looking back and forth between the two men, promptly shot to her feet. At that moment, her main concern was extricating herself from this embarrassing situation. She rushed after Quail as if fleeing the scene of a crime, away from Riftan and the princess. Under the oak tree. Chapter 323. Maxie did not have to look back to know that Riftan was staring furiously after her fleeing figure. Straightening her back, she did her best to look dignified. Only after she was certain they were no longer visible did she glance over her shoulder. After carefully scanning the surroundings, she looked up and caught Quail staring down at her as though she were a strange creature. Embarrassed, Maxie gave a small cough. "Why," he said. You had something to ask me about the basilisk farm? Specifically, to confirm something about the tunnel connected to the farm. Quayle's reply was curt. Seeing that he had no intention of chastising her for her scandalous behavior, the tension eased from Maxie's shoulders. But I have already given you my report. That contains everything I know about the tunnel. I doubt that. There are always details that cannot be documented, he replied, briskly leading them to where the soldiers were dismantling the tents. The men were almost done with the packing by now. Quayle led her into a military barracks that had not yet been taken down. Standing at the entrance, Maxie glanced around the dim tent. Dying embers flickered in the brazier on one side, and next to it was a long table with several chairs. She presumed this was where the temple knights held their meetings. Quayle removed a roll of parchment from a small chest and unfurled it across the table. To utilize the tunnel in this war, we must know everything about it. You are the only person who knows its entire structure. Are you planning to infiltrate the city through the tunnel? Maxie walked over to the table to examine the map. The yellow parchment contained a rendering of the Pamela Plateau, the same one she had seen at every strategy meeting. Opening an ink bottle, Quayle checked its contents before handing it to her. That would be ideal, but the risk is too great. The tunnel is simply too long. Reaching the city from the basilisk farm would take at least 5 hours. If the monsters were to destroy the tunnel or trap us inside, it would be a grave problem indeed. His words chilled Maxie's heart. If the tunnel's exit works in the same way as its entrance, she said, it would certainly make it difficult for our army to infiltrate that way. She recalled the moment she had dived into the tunnel after the goblin. They had been forced to keep going down only because they could not reopen the hidden door. As long as the door's mechanism remained a mystery, the tunnel was as good as useless. Most of the hidden doorways created by the dark mages were decorated with a sculpture of a snake's head. Moving that opened or closed the doors. We also found similar devices within the ruins. But we were unable to figure out how to operate them. He swept his gaze over the marching Wedonian army as he mulled over how he was going to deal with Richard Breston. Just then, his eyes landed on his wife's pale face among the darkly tanned soldiers. He reflexively pulled back the reins. Having dismounted, she was walking in step to the soldiers marching. It appeared she had gotten off her mare to ease the creature's burden however she could. He silently watched her before his face crumpled into a furious scowl. Maxie had walked up to Ruth's spent figure and was pushing the stumbling mage from the back with both hands. Riftan's lips thinned as he looked on over the pathetic scene. He was well aware that his wife felt at ease with Ruth and that their relationship was purely platonic. Nevertheless, he still felt a branding iron searing his skin whenever he saw how familiar they were with each other. He searched his memories to recall if she had ever treated him similarly. Perhaps she had once, but those times were long past. Now they were no better than strangers. He also knew that the blame was solely his. After bitterly watching Maxie and Ruth, Riftan steered his horse away. Suddenly, faint screams sounded in the distance. He jerked his head toward it. The soldiers ahead of him stopped their march and began murmuring among themselves. At first, he could not comprehend why the men had stopped. A second later, the scent of blood carried over to him on the wind. He rode past the knights, who were doing their best to get the soldiers back in formation, and galloped across the field to the head of the army. He reined Talon to a halt as he spotted the pool of blood-soaked snow on one side of the hill. Headless corpses were piled next to it, their pasty, severed heads displayed on pikes nearby. Riftan took in the gruesome sight through narrowed eyes before approaching one of the knights standing next to the corpses. "What is the meaning of this?" The northerner shrugged and said calmly, "They are Baldonian deserters who tried to run away with our provisions." Riftan's face hardened. The displaying of corpses was a cruel punishment reserved for those who had committed atrocious crimes like treason. After scanning the soldiers murmuring in agitation, Riftan barked, "Take down the heads at once. Did you not consider the throngs of monsters that would descend on us with all this blood?" But Sir Richard commanded that they be put up to serve as an example. "More fools might attempt to desert if we don't," the knight replied, looking disgruntled. Riftan stared the northerner down before bringing his sword to the man's neck. "If you do not take those heads down immediately, yours will be put up next to them." A hint of fear rose on the man's face at his threat. After wearily looking up at Riftan, the knight begrudgingly began removing the heads. Riftan watched the man, his gaze thunderous, before giving his orders to the Wedonian soldiers waiting behind him. "Help them bury the bodies." A few men rushed away and returned with shovels. They began digging into the frozen soil, and Riftan stationed himself near to oversee the burial. His face suddenly clouded when he spotted Maxie among the murmuring crowd of soldiers. Her face was pale as she stared at the pikes in horror. It was no use, having seen her terror, he could no longer bring himself to stay away. He leapt down from Talon and strode over to her. Grabbing her by the arm, he spun her away and marched her through the spectators. The palpable shock in her eyes pierced like a dagger to the chest. Under the oak tree. Chapter 324. Riftan took Maxie as far from the execution site as possible. The soldiers advancing across the field behind them looked confused by the sudden standstill. He pushed his way through, stopping next to the billowing Wedonian banner in front of a baggage wagon. When he hoisted Maxie up and onto a space in the compartment, she simply looked back at him in horror, her face ghostly white. He studied her clear gray eyes for a moment before taking his flask from his belt. "Here, have some wine." I am not thirsty." "Have a sip anyway." "You're pale." His firm tone seemed to prompt her into action. She opened it and sniffed its contents. As soon as she took a few cautious sips, she burst into a coughing fit. "Heavens! Why is this so strong?" She handed the flask back with a scowl. Riftan closed the lid and placed it back on his belt. "Strong liquor is useful for fighting the cold or cleaning wounds," he replied stonily. To his relief, she seemed to have regained her composure. With some color returning to her face, Maxie looked out of the wagon uneasily. Why were those men executed? What could they have possibly done to deserve such a cruel death? They were Boltonian deserters. They were executed in accordance with military law. He bent down to extract a blanket from one side of the wagon. Draping it over her shoulders, he said, "Stay here while the men bury the bodies. It shouldn't be longer than 10 minutes. I am all right. I was simply a little shocked." Riftan frowned when he recognized the stubborn look on her face. After pensively staring at the floor of the wagon, Maxie said stiffly, "One have seen far more gruesome corpses in my time as a healer, and no doubt there will be more unspeakable sights to come. So, you needn't try to shield me every time something happens. One assure you, you will not see me faint from shock again." With that, she folded the blanket, placed it aside, and rose to her feet. Riftan stopped her as she tried to get down from the wagon. Without warning, something inside him erupted. "I told you to stay here," he snarled, forcing her back down. He silently cursed himself when he saw defiance growing in her eyes. He knew that browbeating only provoked her to defy him, but that never seemed to stop him from losing his temper time and time again. It almost always made the situation worse. Summoning the last of his self-control, he said, "There is no reason for you to watch the men bury the bodies. It won't take long, so just wait here." That may be true. But one also have no reason to run from it like a frightened child. Pulling her cloak in tight, Maxie blew into her gloved hands to keep warm. Riding next to her, Annette coughed and said, "Thank heavens Master Calto decided to stay behind. We would have had to bury him before the war even started." A short distance away, an exhausted-looking Ruth chortled. Maxie was taken aback at just how pale he was, as if he were at death's door. It made her question how on earth he had managed to follow Riftan around for all those years. "There've been no more deserters for a while now," Armin abruptly muttered after watching the marching soldiers. Maxie looked troubled. The first public execution had failed to stop soldiers from fleeing the army. While some had successfully gotten away, those who were caught had been promptly executed. Though the displaying of heads was abolished due to the objections of those in command, the threat of death hung over all who wished to flee, effectively stopping further defection. While the Boltonian army had the most deserters, the camps of Wedon, Rx, and Levadon also had their share. According to the knights, this was a common occurrence in large-scale campaigns. "Halt! We will camp here for the night." As soon as the booming voice cried out from the front, audible sighs of relief rippled through the ranks. Maxie had no idea how long they had been marching through the violent wind. Her legs were nearly numb from the cold when she dismounted. Soon after, the ever-present Ulyssean rushed to her side. Had this been any other time, she would have pushed him away to assert her independence. However, with her whole body stiff and her muscles aching from shivering in the saddle all day, she was forced to accept his help unsaddling her mare. Leaving Rem in Ulyssean's care, Maxie made her way to where the soldiers were lighting a fire to warm her frigid body. Only when the heat seeped into her did she have the mind to look around. She scanned the faces around the campfire before her gaze wandered beyond the windbreak put up by the soldiers. Riftan was there, giving instructions to the knights from atop his warhorse. Her expression grew concerned. Every time a gust tossed his dark hair, she felt the icy chill in her own body. His face had grown lean over the past few days, adding to her worry. Does he ever rest? As if sensing her eyes on him, Riftan turned his head toward her. She froze as he leapt off his horse and strode over. The final strategy meeting will be held shortly at the front. The mages of the tower are to attend as well. Maxie's eyes widened. Final? That's right, he replied, then furrowed his brow. Were you not aware? We will be at our destination in 2 days. The battle draws near. Her heart sank at his words. Though she had prepared herself for such tidings, her stomach still twisted into knots. She swallowed hard and slowly rose to her feet. Maxie listed the mages under her command: Annette, Armin, Ben, and a new recruit from Undame called Brynlila. Since those in the offensive unit were already at the head of the army with the Osirian troops, these were the mages who would be attending the meeting with her. You are to come as well, Riftan told Ruth, who was trying to remain inconspicuous by huddling in front of the fire. When Ruth reluctantly rose with a sigh, the group followed Riftan to the front, with Ylisian and Elliot close behind. Baron and Garrow, in charge of the rear unit, joined them soon after. Under the oak tree. Chapter 325. Maxie gave them a silent greeting with her eyes. Baron's cavalry unit was in charge of clearing the army's tracks from the rear, which meant he usually only arrived at camp late into the night. It's been a while, my lady, Baron called out jovially. He addressed both Maxie and Annette as he said, after days of having only weather-beaten men for company, I'm relieved to be in the presence of such fine ladies. Annette let out a low snort. Baron chuckled despite her lukewarm response before walking past them to his commander. The impish look on his face vanished, replaced by the air of a dignified knight. I have scouted the western route as you instructed, Commander. I don't believe there are any threats of an ambush. That's not good enough, Riftan said curtly. You must be certain. Baron shrugged. We are not deities. There's a limit to how much information we can gather in such a short time. As far as we can tell, there are no traces of monsters having ever been their eyes' curiosity, and she studied the two men. Had Baron been on some private mission under Riftan's orders? She bit her lip as she glanced at her husband's impassive face. It saddened her that she could not penetrate through to his thoughts even a little. I will have to be content with that, then, Riftan mumbled, mulling it over. With that, he marched on past the soldiers who were setting up tents. Soon, they wove through the Wedonian camp and reached the one bearing Balto's banner. Though the order of the armies changed now and then, it was usually the Temple Knights of Osiria leading, followed by Balto, Arax, Levidan, and Wedon. Thus, they had to walk the length of the whole army to reach the meeting location. Maxie warily eyed the Baltonian soldiers as she willed her aching legs forward. The Northmen's attire were mostly ragged, and there was an emptiness to their sunken eyes and gaunt faces. She found their bleak appearance slightly unsettling. They ate around a fire, sitting hunched against the gale like beasts. Stop looking, Annette warned. Don't give them reason to pick a fight. Maxie looked away. The group quickly cut through the Baltonian camp and reached the Osirians. It appeared that the meeting had started without them inside the Temple Knights' barracks. They caught snatches of heated voices as they drew closer to the large, hexagonal tent in the middle of the encampment. She followed Riftan in with a worried expression. Though 15 or so meetings had been held so far, they had yet to settle on a definitive plan. Not only did the commanding officers refuse to compromise, but the high priests and knights also asserted their opinions. This tense dynamic always seemed to turn meetings into squabbling matches. Finally, Richard Breston remarked as they entered. At his odious tone, Sajuluaran and the commander of the Erexian unit cut short their heated argument. Riftan gave the men a curt nod before walking over to Princess Agnes. The tent did not have enough chairs to seat the 50 or so people gathered inside, so some were perched on wooden crates or barrels while others stood leaning against tent poles. After glancing between the Ream Dragon Knights and the mages, Maxie quietly chose a chair near Riftan. Though the seating was not assigned, she was still nervous that she would be commanded to move. Despite her worries, no one seemed to mind the current arrangement. Once everyone was settled, Qual looked up from the map he had been studying. It appears everyone is here. Let us begin. Is there still more to discuss? Quipped Richard Breston, grabbing a wine cup from the side table beside him. I tire of these pointless arguments. Siege strategies are simple. You either cut their supplies and wait for them to starve or bombard their walls until they collapse. The Baltonian commander stretched out his bulky, muscled legs and propped an elbow on his armrest. Tut, since we're more likely to starve to death before the enemy, our only option is to focus our attack on the vulnerable sections of the ramparts. Selric nodded. It is. From our examination of the rune, we have discovered that it affects the wyverns in 3 ways. First, it mellows the monster's aggression. Second, it heightens their protective instincts, that is, their desire to protect their pack and territory. And finally, it suppresses their appetite. The enemy is essentially controlling the wyverns by suppressing their natural urges, hence it is also possible to produce the opposite effect by slightly altering the rune. Murmurs rippled through the tent. After keenly observing the reaction, Riftan said, "My plan is thus. While the army waits outside, 2 capable mages escorted by 3 knights will infiltrate the city and incite the wyverns into a rampage. Once the city is in chaos, an elite unit will enter through the basilisk tunnel and open the gates for the rest of the army to charge in. If successful, we can conquer the city within 2 days?" After quietly listening to Riftan speak, Richard Breston said derisively, "Are you so sure that everything will go according to your plan? The monster army may be aware of our movements by Novi.lf. They have already fortified their defenses. I highly doubt we'd be able to get in using the same method." "That is true," Riftan admitted after a pause. "If the first plan is thwarted because the enemy's intelligence network is more formidable than we thought, we will proceed to the second plan." "Second plan?" Preston said, cocking an eyebrow. Ignoring him, Riftan continued, "If it becomes apparent that the first plan is infeasible, the coalition army will be notified immediately, after which the siege will begin. This time, we will lure the monsters out from behind their walls to provide an opportunity for a unit to slip into the city." Silence reigned over the tent as he finished his explanation. Everyone seemed to be turning over the plan in their minds. Quailside pensively stroked his chin. "It is going to be a long war. Once the siege starts, it will be difficult to sneak in since the city will be closed off," Riftan admitted. "It might take a long time for the monsters to drop their defenses enough for us to lure them out. We will not be able to avoid heavy casualties in the process." After grimly staring at the map on the tray table, Riftan finished somberly, "We can only hope that the first plan succeeds. Even if we can't reach the wyvern farm, can't we use the tunnel to get into the city?" Riftan shook his head at Sijulu's question. "Not with its structure. To make full use of it, we must first breach the monster's defenses. Since we only have one chance to sneak in, we can't squander that opportunity with an ill-conceived strategy. The covert unit will have to wait for the best moment to seize the city." Pausing, he regarded each of the commanding officers. "If anyone has a better plan, I will concede." While the other knights began deliberating in hushed voices, Sijuluman voiced his support for Riftan's idea. "I accept your plan. The elite unit of the Bolos Royal Knights will take on the infiltration. I have gone ahead and scouted the route leading to the Basilisk Farm." Baron chimed in as though he had been waiting for his chance to speak. "There are no monsters in the area. Though I cannot speak with absolute certainty, I don't believe the monsters are aware that we know of the farm's existence." Maxie's eyes widened as she realized the nature of the clandestine investigation Riftan had ordered. Under the oak tree. Chapter 326. At Riftan's nod, Baron pulled a map from his coat pocket and passed it to Sijuluaran. "I've marked the paths that will keep you hidden, and scouts are searching for a suitable hideout near the tunnel. We should have more information by the morrow." "How very thorough," Sijulu muttered in astonishment as he examined the map. Maxie studied the faces of the other commanding officers. Though Quailian's expression was inscrutable, he did not seem to have any objections. Richard Breston also kept his mouth firmly shut as he observed the situation. Because of his assertion earlier that siege was their only option, he clearly felt that voicing an objection now would only cast him in a bad light. When none of his listeners made any objections, Riftan moved on. "If there are no objections, 300 men will be chosen for the elite unit that will be stationed in the west as soon as the scout party returns. They will be hiding their tracks as they move, so they will take some time to get here. That is why they must depart at the earliest opportunity." Sijulu's brow creased into deep lines. "Shouldn't we send more?" he asked, cocking his head. Riftan shook his head. "If the first plan fails, the unit will have to stay hidden for at least half a month. The maximum amount of provisions we can allot them will only be enough for 300, and any more will only increase the chances of discovery." "And who will infiltrate the wyvern farm?" Agnes asked after carefully poring over the map. Maxie bunched the hem of her sleeve in her fist. Though she had 1809 expected this, her heart still dropped. She hastily looked down to I will, Riftan said without a moment's hesitation. Maxie bunched the hem of her sleeve in her fist. Though she had expected this, her heart still dropped. She hastily looked down to hide her distress. Once the wyverns are driven into a frenzy, those in the farm will also be in danger, Riftan added flatly. The task must fall to someone who has successfully infiltrated the city before and has extensive experience with the dragon subspecies. The commander of the Erexian army blurted, then, who will lead the Wedonian? Are you questioning my competence? Princess Agnes shot back, along with an icy glare. The man promptly closed his mouth. After giving the Erexian commander a warning look, Agnes turned her head to Riftan with a dignified air. What I want to know is who will be dismantling the rune. Albern had been listening to the tense discussions in silence. He answered the princess as soon as she posed the question. That would be us. All eyes turned to where the mages of Nornai were seated. Geoffrey and I are the ones who slipped into the monster city with Sir Riftan, Albern continued calmly. As we also copied the rune, we would be the best fit for the job. Agnes nodded in agreement. With that, the knights began to address Riftan's second plan. They discussed infantry, archers, and cavalry positions in rapid succession, followed by the placement of the catapults, routes, and countermeasures in case of a wyvern attack. All the information left Maxie feeling addled. She had yet to even process her husband's declaration to walk into enemy territory. At a loss for what to do, she looked up at Riftan. Her head acknowledged he was simply doing his duty as a knight, but her heart filled with resentment. There was anger, too. While he was excessively protective of Maxie, he never seemed to have any regard for his own safety. Nonetheless, she knew she was being unreasonable. Riftan was a knight, and in a war with tens of thousands of lives at stake, it would be dishonorable for a commanding officer to think only of his own well-being. As she silently fought the urge to dissuade him from this reckless plan, Quail suddenly directed a question at her. How many mages in the support unit are capable of defensive magic? Maxie did not catch his question right away, and it was only when she noticed everyone looking at her that she snapped out of her thoughts. The mages of the tower are all capable of basic defensive magic, she hastily replied, and 2 among the unaffiliated mages are as well. A total of 7. When the scouts returned the following morning, the Bolos Royal Knights made prompt preparations to depart. While they saddled their horses with a month's worth of provisions, the soldiers loaded 3 wagons with coal, firewood, and horse fodder, and the mages packed herbs and magical devices. 7 more had been chosen to join the Bolos Royal Knights, including Hans, the paladin who had participated in the expedition to the Pamela Plateau, 5 of his subordinates, and a mage of the tower. This mage would be responsible for opening the doors of the tunnel and thus served a critical role. After careful deliberation, Selric chose Miriam for the job. Though she specialized in offensive magic, Miriam was adept with magical devices. Above all, they could use her fairies for long-distance communication. Once everything was ready, the covert team wasted no time setting out west. Maxie anxiously watched their disappearing figures. This could be the last time I see them. She snapped herself out of the bleak thought and tried to keep her mind from wandering back. Imagining the worst had always been a terrible habit of hers. Turning away, Maxie went to help the others break camp. They would soon begin marching east along the mountains surrounding the monster city, where they would hide until they received the signal to strike. Her stomach twisted into knots. Nausea surged through her as memories of past calamities resurfaced. The only difference this time was that they would be fighting in monster territory, away from human settlements. Steeling herself, she loaded her bags onto Rem's saddle with renewed determination. Just as she was about to mount her horse, she spotted Riftan. He usually inspected the formation at the head of the Wedonian army with Princess Agnes before every march, so Maxie was surprised when she saw him striding toward her. Stopping in front of her, he sounded strangely nervous as he said, "Can I have a moment?" Maxie looked up at him in bewilderment. Ever since the start of this campaign, he had been nothing but impersonal with her. She could hardly remember their last intimate conversation. What could he possibly want to talk about? Growing anxious, her throat tightened as she nodded. Shall we go somewhere more private? No, that won't be necessary. I just wanted to ask. He trailed off, looking agitated. Having never seen him like this, Maxie blinked in a daze. What was making this terribly self-possessed man so flustered? Nervously rubbing his lips with an armored hand, Riftan continued hesitantly, "About my coat. Did you? Your coat?" Maxie repeated, taken aback by the unexpected topic. I asked Ulysses to return it to you at dawn. Did you not receive it? Riftan appeared almost distraught as he dumbly opened and closed his mouth. He eventually pressed his lips together as though at a loss for words, and all emotion vanished from his face. No, I received it. I apologize for taking your time. It's not important, so don't concern yourself. With that, he turned around and started walking away. Only then did Maxie recall the pouch. Hurriedly stopping him, she lifted the leather pouch. Hey, are you looking for this? It fell off last night while I was getting changed. I was going to sew it back on, but it completely slipped my mind. Riftan's eyes clouded with dismay as they landed on the pouch. He snatched it from her and said accusingly, Did you look inside? Startled by his heated reaction, Maxie hunched her shoulders and shamefully nodded. She saw his jaw tighten as he silently searched her face. A moment later, his expression turned cold. He said icily, You don't have to trouble yourself. I found what I was after, so you can return to what you were doing. With that, he spun on his heels and marched away. Maxie watched him go in bewilderment. She simply could not understand the reason for his reaction. Is that grungy string that important to him? Right at that moment, a memory flashed in her mind. She stiffened, then scurried after him. The string inside. Is it the adornment I gave you? She said, her tone uncertain. She got her answer as his bronze neck turned red. Under the oak tree. Chapter 327. Maxie was stunned. The string was a piece of a tassel she had given him almost 4 years ago. It had been an adornment for his sword belt, an impulsive purchase while wandering the market. Feeling her throat close up, she mumbled in a quivering voice, I didn't think. Would you still have it? Riftan clutched the pouch and kept his gaze on the ground. I only carried it with me out of habit, he said defensively. The excuse must have sounded unconvincing even to his ears, as his cheeks burned a deeper shade of red. He swore under his breath and quickened his steps. Maxie instinctively latched onto his cloak. But you came looking for it as soon as you found it missing. Riftan's face contorted ever so slightly, but he offered no reply and kept walking. Maxie bit her lip as she followed him, unable to understand why he was trying to conceal an obvious truth, nor why she felt compelled to force him to admit it. Perhaps the latter was due to his stubborn attempt to build a wall between them. Seeing him compulsively hide his true feelings was exhausting. It was unbearable, this act of treating each other like strangers. Maxie wanted to break down his defenses, she wanted the old Riftan back. Suddenly, the floodgates opened, and she yanked at his clothes. The emotions she had suppressed until now came pouring out all at once. You have been cherishing it, haven't you? Why, you kept it with you. Even with it in tatters. Riftan came to an abrupt halt and whirled around. What is it you wish to hear from me? What do you want to confirm? Was laying myself bare for you not enough? Maxie shrank back at his bitter tone. His self-control gone, Riftan began to unleash his emotions. As soon as I heard you were out of Norney, I abandoned everything to see you. My only concern was you, even though I feigned indifference. But you already know that. I've already told you the mere thought of you getting hurt terrifies me, that I'm close to losing my mind from worry. Are you still not satisfied with that? The anguish and shame swirling in his eyes made them appear a dark onyx. He looked down at the pouch in his hands, and his lips twisted into a self-deprecating smile. Yes, I still have it. But what of it? Why does it matter when you don't even recall giving me such a thing? Don't you agree? Maxie reflexively went to deny it before she realized he was right. She had not recognized the adornment right away. She pressed her lips together. Riftan's fingers tightened around the pouch. And yet Closing his mouth, he stared down at his fist. He raised his arm as if to fling the pouch away, then froze. As still as a statue, Riftan stood there for a long time, staring out at the snowy field. In the end, he could not bring himself to do it and slowly lowered his arm. When he turned around to face her, all Maxie could see was a vulnerable little boy. She felt her eyes burn. This was what he was trying to hide behind his cold armor. Tell me something, he said abruptly. 3 years ago, when I told you I wouldn't wait for you. Seized with superstitious fear, she started to tear the handkerchief into thin strips with a dagger. Annette, who had been idly sipping beer in front of the fire, looked over at her with a puzzled expression. What are you doing? Maxie blushed, quickly hiding the pieces inside her clothes. After a moment, she took them out again, knowing she had no time to waste. I am making an adornment for my husband. Before he leaves, she confessed, her voice barely audible. Adornment? Annette asked, arching a brow. Maxie nodded. The kind you tie to a belt. Annette raised her head to look at the knights and muttered something in understanding when she saw the long braided cords hanging from their sword belts. You're awfully devoted. I don't understand what you see in that cold man. He isn't cold, Maxie replied sullenly. She focused on braiding the strips of fabric together. Cutting a cloth into long strips might have been simple, but intertwining them into an intricate shape was a different matter. After wordlessly watching Maxie labor away, Annette fished something out of her bag. It'll look dull unless you add another color. Here, try adding some of these in the middle. Annette tore the white linen she had brought to use as dressing into strips and offered them to Maxie. No doubt, watching Maxie's endeavor had roused her craftsman's sensibilities. Maxie gratefully accepted the 2 white strips and braided them with the dark blue. After a few minutes, a palm-sized, unevenly braided tassel lay in her hand. Maxie's shoulders sagged with dismay. It looks horrid. Annette, who had watched her work with a blank face, said with a chuckle, What do you mean? I think it's cute. Aren't navy and white the Ream Dragon Knight colors? I think it would suit his armor well. Reassured, Maxie resumed her work. When she was halfway done, Heberon's booming voice carried to them from up ahead. Rest is over. Put out the fires. Leave no traces. Maxie shoved the tassel into her bag and hastily put out the fire. She then gathered the burnt wood in a sack and placed it on a wagon. Since they had to conserve as much kindling as possible, they had to rummage through the ashes for any usable fuel every time. Once the army was ready to depart, the soldiers got in formation and resumed their march. Though Maxie tried to work on the tassel whenever she could, interlacing strips of fabric atop a moving horse was no easy feat. Her fingers grew stiff from the cold, and her knots became a tangled mess. She gave up shortly after and shifted her attention to keeping up with the soldiers. When evening finally came, the men started setting up camp behind a towering crag. Maxie hurriedly finished her supper and retired to the mage's tent to finish the tassel. The hastily made charm was embarrassing even to look at. Maxie stared at the finished adornment in dismay before irritably shoving it into her bag. Riftan would no doubt accept it, and knowing that made her upset. Just the thought of him cherishing such a shabby trinket made her heart crumble. Furious with herself, she began to resent this whole situation. Under the oak tree. Chapter 328. Maxie angrily rubbed her eyes. Though she wanted to do something wonderful for Riftan, she had neither the time nor the means. She recalled the bundle of her letters that he had kept. It occurred to her that she could have used the time she had spent writing those to create a memorable gift for him instead. Bitterly, she thought back to how she had deprived herself of sleep for months crafting letters she had not even been able to send in the end. What if she would never be able to mend things with him? She shot to her feet and began pacing the length of the tent. Even if they returned to Anatole after the war, she doubted their relationship would revert to what it once was. And would they even be able to return home? Suddenly, a suffocating fear seized her. She could not let him leave on such a dangerous mission without saying something, anything. Before she could organize her thoughts, she threw on her coat and left the tent. A gale lashed at her face as she stepped outside. She waited momentarily for the wind to settle before treading through the snow. Evenings in the north felt 1,000 times colder and darker than in the south. The nights were starless, and the relentless wind battered the camp day in, day out. With whiffs of white vapor issuing from her mouth, Maxie glanced around. The night watch kept warm around braziers dotted around the camp. With the help of the glowing lights, it did not take long for her to spot the Ream Dragon Knight's banner. She was about to head toward it when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Startled, she turned around, and an apologetic voice said above her head, "Forgive me for startling you, my lady." Maxie relaxed as she recognized Ulysses. It's all right. It was too dark to see you. My apologies. I failed to consider that when I rushed after you. As if to allay her fears, Ulysses took a few steps closer to the light. Maxie smiled when the firelight dimly illuminated the knight's youthful features. Are you on the night watch again? No, my lady. I was just inspecting the rear. If you tell me where you are headed, I shall gladly escort you. That won't be necessary. Ulysses' face grew stern when she waved her hand with a troubled expression. You should not roam the camp on your own, my lady. You might run into dangerous men. Maxie rolled her eyes. While that might be true of other camps, the soldiers of Levedon and Witten regarded her with a mortifying level of deference. Nevertheless, she was in no mood to argue. She nodded and said, I wanted to go see Riftan. Sir Riftan has gone to see the commander of the Temple Knights in his tent, Ulysses explained, pointing in the opposite direction of where she walked. Maxie's face clouded. Wasn't the last strategy meeting the final one? After staring at the floor, Riftan spoke as if he were trying his best to sound gentle. I'm not trying to be snide. I really mean it, so forget what I said yesterday. With that, he turned around and began walking out of the stable. Maxie felt her whole body freeze over. Why was he saying such things now, as if this meeting was their last? Her stunned face crumbled, and she chased after him. She grabbed his arm and snapped, how could you even think that? Riftan looked taken aback. Maxie's lips quivered, and her voice cracked as she forced out, I was only saddened by the fact that I made you so anxious. I hated knowing that I made you feel that way. If only I had more faith in you. If only I had been stronger. You wouldn't have had to suffer like this. Her nose prickled, and she stopped as tears spilled down her cheeks. Clutching his clothes, she hung her head and said, I wanted to change for your sake. I managed to do that because of you. I have always hated myself. But thanks to you cherishing the likes of me, I've finally come to like myself. It is because of you that I. The tremor in her voice grew worse as the emotions flooded her, and her face flushed. Though she had come to accept her impediment, she had never hated her stuttering tongue more than at this very moment. She wanted to be able to convey her feelings clearly, leaving no room for doubt. She stared up at him through her tears. Riftan looked back at her in a daze. Was he truly unaware of how she felt? Wiping her eyes on her sleeve, Maxie took out the hideous sword belt adornment from her bag. Though her face burned, she saw no point in keeping up appearances now. I will make something better for you when we go home, she said, sniffling while tying the tassel to his belt. I will practice. And make you the most beautiful charm in the world. When it gets worn, I'll make you a new one. And when that needs replacing, I'll make you another. I'll keep making them for you, so. Maxie's breath caught in her chest as Riftan dragged her behind a tent. Backing her up against a rock, he hoisted her off the ground and pulled her into a passionate kiss. She felt her tears trickle between their lips. His firm hand cupped her head in place. Trapped between an icy boulder and his steel-like body, Maxie writhed like a helpless lamb. Fire coursed through her frozen limbs. He panted over her lips as he spoke, his voice hoarse. Swear to me. Dropping to a low whisper, he continued, swear that you won't do anything reckless, that you will put your safety first at all times. Maxie bobbed her head, tears brimming in her eyes. Riftan bit her lip. Say it. Swear to me that you will not throw your life away. I swear. Maxie let out a small sob as she pressed her lips to his, and when Riftan tightened his arms around her in a crushing embrace, she clasped back with all her strength. Under the oak tree. Chapter 329. Riftan's shaky breath played over her nape, and she could sense the bone-gnawing fear coming off him in waves. She clung to his neck as though she were drowning. At that moment, she wanted him more intensely than ever. She could not bear to be parted from him. Sobbing, she rubbed her cheek in his hair before seeking his lips. Riftan cupped her face with a gloved hand and pushed his tongue into her mouth. Sobs broke out of her between feverish breaths. Kissing her cheek, Riftan mumbled something gruffly. Though it was much too low for Maxie to catch, she reasoned that he was telling her not to cry. Nodding, she looked past his shoulder at the rising sun. She could hear the knights ordering the soldiers to make haste. His arms wrapped around her, Riftan muttered, I must go now. Maxie nodded again but kept her forehead pressed on his shoulder, and he did not move either. They stayed that way for a long time. When the knight's shouts reached them, she finally loosened her arms around his neck. Only God knew how difficult that one action was for her. Riftan carefully lowered her to the ground and took a measured step back. His eyes were feverish as he gazed down at her. Then, squeezing them shut, he whirled around. Maxie silently stared at his dark hair gleaming blue in the sunlight. Each step he took seemed to puncture her heart. She wiped her wet cheeks on her sleeve, wondering if she had properly conveyed her feelings to him. It suddenly occurred to her that all the sobbing had prevented her from saying the most important thing. She hastily chased after him. The soldiers had taken down most of the tents and were now loading the wagons. Slipping past them, she stopped when she spotted Riftan walking with Baron, Elliot, and Princess Agnes. They were engaged in a loud discussion as they made their way to the head of the formation. Maxie vacantly watched Riftan's cloak flutter in the wind before weakly turning away. The coalition army set up base in a narrow pass wedged between a steep, rocky mountain and a wall of towering rock and ice. the perfect place to lie in wait. As the soldiers stealthily unpacked, the high priests cast barriers around the mountain range to conceal them from monsters. The assembling of the siege weapons also began that day. Warriors transformed into carpenters, the pounding of their hammers ringing out across the pass. To prevent the noise from leaking, the mages of Seegru inscribed runes all over the encampment to manipulate the airflow. They also cast a detection spell that would alert them to the presence of monsters. Meanwhile, Maxie and the other mages of Gnome Hall inspected the runes on the siege weapons. Knowing that their offense would commence in a few days, Maxie inspected and re-inspected the magical devices with near-obsessive compulsion. She could not shake the fear that the devices would fail to function at a crucial moment. In the end, Annette was unable to stand her fixation any longer. "That's enough. You've already checked that one twice," she said irritably. "It's going to work just fine, so give it a rest." Maxie ignored her friend's exasperation and continued inspecting the mantlet. Though her limbs felt as heavy as lead from fatigue, she found it impossible to stay still even for a moment. She infused mana into a magical device installed on a shield to ensure there was nothing wrong with the mana circuit. Just then, a familiar voice addressed her. "May I have a moment of your time, my lady?" When she looked up, she found Ruth standing a few paces away. She put down her tools with a puzzled look and walked over to him. "Is something the matter?" Maxie regarded Ruth as if seeing him in a new light. Because of his pathetic antics of late, she had nearly forgotten that he was considered a prodigy even by Nornae's standards. She nodded, feeling somewhat reassured. "That makes me greatly relieved. But are you all right with this decision?" "I am not," Ruth replied despondently, "but I have no choice. If you recall, I also have instructions from my uncle to fulfill." His expression grew cautious. Maxie did not understand what he meant at first, but her face hardened when she recalled what he had told her before their initial departure for the Monster City. The secret instructions Kalto had given his nephew were, should he discover them, to immediately destroy any evidence of the Dark Mage's attempt to create their own purification spell. After glancing at the Temple Knight's barracks, Ruth added quietly, "If we succeed in capturing the city, the church will no doubt prevent the tower's mages from accessing anything pertaining to dark magic. If possible, I would like to search the city before that happens and eliminate any threats before they lead to bigger problems." Maxie swallowed hard. "But will you even have the time?" "It will certainly be difficult, but I still have to try," he replied, sighing deeply. Maxie sighed along with him. She now had one more thing to worry about. As expected, Ruth had not come bearing good news. She was silently grumbling about this when she heard Riftan's cold voice calling from afar. "Ruth Serbal. Why aren't you ready to depart?" Yes, I'm coming," Ruth replied flatly before giving her an imploring look. "Please, my lady, don't do anything reckless. I am begging you." "You should go," Maxie replied irritably, pushing him from behind. Ruth trudged over to where Riftan was waiting for him. Her husband silently regarded her for a moment before turning his attention to the squire who passed him Talon's reins. Maxie watched as Riftan tied his luggage to his saddle. Geoffrey, Elliot, and a paladin named Luke followed suit next to him. When Ruth returned with a horse and finished securing his belongings, the group mounted their steeds in unison. Maxie suppressed the urge to run and cling to Riftan like a small child. If it would help lessen his worries even a little, she wanted to appear as undaunted as possible. Bracing herself, she slowly walked behind the knights gathered to see them off. Riftan abruptly stopped his instruction to Hebarin as she approached. "You must return safely," Maxie said, forcing a smile. To her great relief, she managed to sound calm. Riftan regarded her silently, intimidating atop his warhorse. He also appeared exceptionally calm and aloof. "May victory be on your side," he said after a while. Maxie held back her tears as she echoed, "May victory be on your side." As Riftan steered his horse away, she exchanged farewells with Ruth, Elliot, and Geoffrey. Through it all, her attention was fixed on her husband. Soon, he dug his spurs into Talon's side, and the 5 men rode out of the narrow pass. Maxie stood in place until their figures disappeared. It began snowing the following day. Sheltered under a canopy, Maxie watched as the soldiers assembled the siege weapons. 8 siege towers, hundreds of giant crossbows, and 40 catapults were scattered all over the camp. It was truly a formidable sight to behold. The commanding officers of each kingdom waited at the center of camp for the scouts to return. Meanwhile, the knights held drills on one side of the spacious area. A fraught atmosphere hung over the coalition army. It was a nerve-wracking tension Maxie had never felt before, not even when she had served as a healer at Athlana Castle all those years ago. Under the oak tree. Chapter 330. Maximilian, can you come with me to the central barracks? Maxie had been watching the snow flurries with a heavy heart when Princess Agnes called to her. Upon turning, she spotted the princess crossing the camp with her royal guards, dressed in a green tunic and silver armor. Maxie's gaze shifted to the princess's slim rapier and small battle axe hanging from her waist. Princess Agnes occasionally donned a helmet and led her men into mock battle, appearing more a warrior than a mage while bellowing orders and swinging her sword from atop her warhorse. Every time Maxie saw her, she felt a strange mix of envy and jealousy for getting to share the same world as Riftan. Burying her emotions, Maxie asked politely, "Is something the matter?" We had finalized the placement of the battalions. The mages should also acquaint themselves with the arrangement to make assisting during the battle easier. The princess tilted her chin toward the large barracks behind a rock face. "Come with me." Maxie pulled her hood over her head and hurried after the princess, who regarded her with a warm smile. "We haven't had much time to talk. Is the work manageable?" "My work is insignificant compared to what you must do, Your Highness." Once again with the formalities, sighed the princess. "I wish you wouldn't be so stiff with me. I feel as if I've been walking on ice since the start of this campaign because of Riftan." Maxie eyed her with suspicion. Without thinking, she replied curtly, "You seem to get along just fine." For that to be the case. Agnes's eyes widened, and Maxie felt her cheeks burning. Trying to make up for it, she stuttered, "Why, you were always together. As thick as thieves." "Well, Riftan is my chief aide," Agnes replied, scratching her cheek with an ambiguous expression. "But any friendship we had was lost a long time ago. He has resented me ever since I took you away to the Mage Tower. You have no idea how furious he was." The princess hugged herself, shuddering lightly. "I thought he would have softened after your return, but I was wrong. Frankly, I've been on edge this entire time." Maxie scowled as the memory of the two whispering during strategy meetings flashed in her mind. An intense mistrust surged within her. Despite this, she did not wish to argue over such petty matters with war on the horizon, and she gave the princess a placid smile. It was a relief when they reached the barracks, putting an end to the embarrassing conversation. Inside the large, brazier-warmed tent, many of the coalition's key members had already gathered. The commanders and vice-commanders stood around a long table with the high priests on one side, while the mages sat in a small circle on the other. Maxie walked past the pile of weapons and cargo boxes to join them. Selric was muttering something in Elvish while stroking his thick beard, but he looked up when he noticed her approaching. "Oh, it's you," he said. Sensing that something had happened, Maxie hurried up to him. "Is something wrong?" "No," Anton replied from his seat beside Selric. "Everything is fine. Miriam sent word that they have successfully found a hideout near the Basilisk farm." He pointed to the copper bird cage next to the brazier where two fairies sat on a perch, nibbling on sugar cubes the size of acorns. Selric heaved a sigh. "They have carried out the first phase of your husband's plan. Now we wait for the signal to begin the siege." As Princess Agnes proceeded to explain how the siege would be carried out, Maxie felt her stomach shriveling in on itself. Her eyes shifted around the table as she listened. Sitting at the end was Quao Lian, conversing with the clerics. To his left sat the Northern Knights, fiddling with their weapons and drinking liquor, and to his right were the Ream Dragon Knights and the soldiers of Arx. It was beyond her how they were all able to tolerate such fraught tension. Maxie nervously wet her lips as she strove not to miss any of the details being discussed around the table. If the burden of leading 20 mages was this heavy, she could not imagine having the lives of thousands in her hands. The thought alone terrified her. Eventually, Maxie excused herself and left the tent with Agnes's sketch of the army's battle formations clutched in hand. As always, the pounding of hammers filled the camp. Maxie looked up at the jagged mountains past the line of catapults. Somewhere over those peaks, Riftan was riding into the freezing wind. Her heart ached at the thought. Though they had only been apart a day, she missed him terribly. How many more times would she have to endure such anguish in the future? She quickened her steps in an effort to shake off the depressing thought. The days passed in suffocating tension. When the appointed date came and went without word from Riftan, the knights grew visibly anxious. The fear that something terrible had happened held Maxie in a vice grip. The monsters could have discovered them, or Miriam's fairies might have escaped during the mission. The awful possibilities had Maxie gnawing her nails and pacing anxiously in front of a tent. Noticing her distress, a Wedonian soldier cautiously approached her. "Lady Calypse, we have lit braziers in the shared barracks. Why not rest there a moment?" Knowing he only meant well, Maxie forced a smile. The soldier's face brightened when she allowed him to lead her to a tent on the fringe of the encampment. Just then, a sharp cry rang through the air. Maxie whipped her head around to see black smoke rising from a siege tower behind the rock face. Her blood ran cold. For a moment, she became a statue, unmoving as she stared at the dancing flames. Returning to her senses, she scrambled into action. She saw soldiers pouring dirt and water over the beams of the burning siege tower as she approached. Despite putting out the fire quickly, the damage was done. An entire side of the tower was charred. Maxie pushed through the soldiers and inspected the blackened wood with her fingers. There was no way the structure would be able to bear any weight. How did this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Goblins snuck into the camp." Maxie whirled around at the voice. Kuala Leon was striding over to them, his dark robe billowing in the wind. "Goblins?" Maxie echoed, her face blanching. "Yes, 6 in total. 5 were dealt with quickly, but 1 got away after starting the fire. It escaped through a small tunnel in the ground." That means. "It means your husband's first plan has failed." Richard Preston's sneering tone reached them, and Maxie turned to see him roughly pushing his way through the troops. She regarded him grimly as he inspected the half-burned siege tower, his lips pursed in a silent whistle. "We have no choice now," said Preston. "We must strike before the goblin informs the monster army of our presence. But we have yet to receive any word from. This is no time to sit idly waiting for that bastard." Preston looked down at Maxie, a vicious glint in his red eyes.